Right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, and this is going to be another solo show. This time I'm trying to complete my promise to Chris Date back when we did our show on Calvinism versus Molinism and/or Arminianism. And I promised him at that time to do a show after I finished my Cosmological Argument, sort of an appendix show or an excursus type show where I talk about God's relationship to time. So that's what this is. So that's what I want to get into, and let's get into it right away. Oh, and just before we do get into that, so just by way of announcement, so after I finish this solo show on my Cosmological Argument Appendix, or the God's relationship to time, I'm going to do another Shroud show on the Scorch hypotheses and why those fail as an ordinary artistic mechanism for explaining the formation of the images on the Shroud of Turin. And finally, after that, then I'm going to get into the Jesus mythicism promise for, I think her name was White Girl on Instagram. I promised her I would do another show on Jesus mythicism at some point this summer, so I'm going to do my best to get that done. Then after that, for my solo show, the next podcast is going to be back into the arguments for a Shroud show after that. And I'm hoping to get into the ontological argument and work on that over time. So that's the plan of action for the solo show. Obviously, the Shroud shows will be coming out increasingly over time because I've already done all the work. That's entirely written up, so it just takes a couple days, few days to make the video and everything like that. I also have discussion shows. So TheoGeeks episode 2 is going to be coming out. That's going to be on Genesis chapter 1 and the interpretation of that. So that's coming out next week. And some other discussion shows are in the works. So yeah, keep in touch. Other than that, let's get into the show about God's relationship to time. Okay, so the question of God's eternity is obviously a fundamentally important question. We definitely know from the Bible that God is in fact eternal. We also know from the success of our cosmological argument. He's not just eternal, he's also logically and metaphysically necessary. But an essential element of that is God's eternality. And we have to ask the question, well, in what sense is God eternal? Is he timeless, meaning he's atemporal? He's totally outside it and transcendent to time. He has no temporal locations or extension dimensions to him. He's not extended throughout time, and he's not located at any moment within time. So that's the timeless understanding. And he also he lacks what are called earlier or later than relations or phases to his life. So that's what it means for God to be timeless. On the other side, God could be seen to be temporal or everlasting in terms of his eternality. So this obviously just entails the opposite of God's being timeless. So number one, God does have temporal dimensions. He's both temporally extended throughout all of time, and he's located at every single moment of time. Whenever there's an interval or point of time, God exists at that moment in time. So and then he also has earlier and later than relations and or phases to his temporal life. So that's the contrast, what it means for God to be timeless versus temporal in a nutshell. It's important to note here that logically speaking, these two things, God's timelessness and or his temporality, are contradictories. It's logically impossible via the violating of the logical law of non-contradiction for both to be true. So sometimes you'll hear lay Christians try to say, well, I think that God is both timeless and temporal. That's logically impossible. God cannot be both timeless and temporal in the same sense at the same time. That violates the logical law of non-contradiction. Now, as we're going to see, I have a thesis about God being timeless and also being temporal, but there's a trick to that. It's not in the same sense or at the same time. And therefore it's not a violation of the logical law of non-contradiction. But I'll explain that when I get into William Lane Craig's view on this, a view that I have adopted myself. So just understand, God's being timeless and temporal are logically contradictory. He cannot be both and of those things at the same time. Now, how do we know which God is eternal? We know that for sure. That's 100% proven in the Bible. Zero doubt. Nobody disagrees about that. But is God timeless or is he temporal in his eternality? And with the temporal dimension, that includes either our dimension of time and or a hyper dimension or dimensions, plural, of time. Either way, that's God's being temporality. And when we talk about God being temporal, that includes the B theory of time or the A theory of time or a hybrid of A-B theory of time. That just basically says the B theory is within time, but time is tenseless. It's like a block. Everything exists without tense. Or the A theory of time is the dynamic theory of time or tensed theory of time. So only the present moment exists. Whereas on the B theory, the past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. And on possibilism, which is the hybrid view, that's where the past and present exist, but the future is yet to exist. So it's like a growing block into the future. Just to define some terms about that. In terms of the Bible isn't clear either way. There are some verses that hint that God is timeless, like in Jude, I think it is, where it speaks of God existing before time. Now, obviously, that's a logical contradiction. There is no such thing as before time, as though there's a temporal moment before temporal moments exist or something like that. But the Bible's not a philosophical text, and I think that we understand Jude is trying to say God transcends time before the beginning of the universe or something like that. But then there's also verses that clearly speak of God as being everlasting from everlasting, existing for all temporal moments and stuff like that. So the Bible's just not clear. It's not conclusive or decisive either way as to the mode of God's eternality. Either or, it could be consistent with the biblical worldview in terms of God's being eternal. You can argue it either way once you go with proper hermeneutics and stuff like that. Whatever is the truth, it doesn't contradict the Bible. Okay, great. So if the Bible doesn't help us, then that means we need to rely on philosophical arguments to try and decide, is God timeless or is he temporal in his eternality? On that front, I'm going to assess 3 arguments for God's divine timelessness and contrast that with 3 arguments for God's being temporal. And we're going to see how we can assess those arguments, and then in the light of those philosophical arguments and metaphysical arguments, reconcile, well, what is the truth? What is God's eternal nature? What does that entail? Timelessness or temporality? So that's what we're going to get into. So let's get into the first argument. I'm going to start off looking at the case for divine timelessness. And so what are the first argument for God's divine timelessness are based on the properties of divine simplicity and divine immutability. So if either of these attributes are true, well, then it's argued that God's timelessness is logically entailed in the truth of these 2 other attributes of God. So how does this argument work? Okay, so just going at giving the argument in premise format to start as a logically deductive argument. So remember that we briefly mentioned in part 5a of our Cosmological Argument proper series, some Christian philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas. I mentioned Thomas Aquinas, and he was someone who argued for God's divine simplicity. So when I was addressing the gap problem in the Cosmological Argument in part 5a, that video, I mentioned that, well, some philosophers offer arguments for God's divine simplicity and try to get that attribute on the basis of the truth of the Cosmological Argument proper. But here, so they'll say if divine simplicity is true, and or if the property of divine immutability is true, then necessarily God is timeless. And it's important to note that when we're talking about divine simplicity and immutability, it's of a special sort. It's of a doctrine that existed in the medieval period and is not popular today among Christian philosophers, theologians, and logicians. Virtually nobody believes this today in academia or that sort of thing. But they were very popular during the medieval era, where the medieval scholastics like Thomas Aquinas were heavily influenced by false ancient Greek philosophies and stuff where they picture God, some kind of immutable being or something like that. Immutability just means that God is unchangeable. In the medieval sense of the word, God is totally unchangeable. He's like a frozen statue, a block. Can't change, can't do nothing. Simplicity in terms of the medieval doctrine He's absolute simplicity. So this is the way there's no differentiation. So God's goodness is the exact same as his property of omnipotence, is the exact same as the property of omniscience and omnipresence. They're all one on this view, including God's existence. That's God's essence, is just existence. He's just pure existence. That's what God is. That's the medieval doctrine of simplicity that's radical and virtually nobody in the know believes today. And for good reason, either Christian or atheist and that sort of thing. But anyways, let's put, what are the premises of this argument for divine timelessness based on the truth of divine simplicity and immutability? So premise number one, God is simple and or immutable in the medieval doctrinal sense of the words. Premise number two, if God is simple and or immutable in the medieval doctrinal sense of the words, then he is not temporal. From that we get sub-conclusion 1, or premise 3, well, thus God is not temporal. And then our main conclusion, therefore God must be timeless. And the reason we get this, so this argument is logically valid. It commits no formal nor informal fallacies. And thus it all depends on, well, are the premises true or provably true or not on a balance of probabilities? Is the argument logically sound or not? And the first order of business is to say, well, look, in terms of the conclusion and sub-conclusion 1, or premise 3, these are obviously true. They follow necessarily and inevitably, the main conclusion follows necessarily and inevitably from the truth of the three premises. And we get, if God is not temporal, as premise 3 concludes from the first two premises, well, then it follows that God must be timeless, because God's timelessness and temporality are logically contradictory, as we mentioned earlier. So if God is not temporal, he necessarily must be timeless, or vice versa. If we can prove God is timeless, then that God is not timeless, then he necessarily is temporal. You're either one or the other. There's no middle options. This is a true dichotomy. So that's how we get the main conclusion from the truth of premise 3. We know that God's timeless because we can prove that God is not temporal. But how do we get that premise 3 then? Well, that's a sub-conclusion based on premises 1 and 2. Now with premise number 2, that one is also true. If God is simple and or immutable in the medieval sense, then he is not temporal. And this is absolute certainty. It's true because of what those doctrines entail, right? So if you think about it, what is simplicity? Well, it means he's absolutely simple. He has no differentiated internal aspects at all, or properties and or relations. When a being is temporal, they necessarily and inherently stand in temporal relations. And that's a changing relationship over time and that sort of thing. So if God is simple, and the medieval definition of simplicity is not the modern one, where he's a simple being in that he's a united soul, he has diverse differentiated internal aspects like properties, and if you're a Trinitarian, by the way, he's three separate persons, which the medieval divine simplicity doctrine had to deny. And I kind of go over that. Thomas Aquinas's it's called the Latin or antisocial model, Trinitarian model, that a lot of medieval scholars held to in the West. And that's complete nonsense. That's basically a Unitarian, it's even worse than a Unitarian concept of God, because it's just absolute being, absolute pure existence. It's not even a person that has different internal properties, attributes, different thoughts, different succession of actions, stuff like that. None of that applies to this doctrine of divine simplicity. And that's logically absurd, by the way. That's an argument against. We know that divine simplicity is false, but we'll come to that in a moment. But assuming that it is true, well then, yeah, he would be totally devoid of all temporal relations and that sort of thing. It's not just that he lacks divisible or separable parts, which is the modern definition of divine simplicity, because God is one united single soul or spiritual substance with multiple internal differentiated aspects. No, this is he's an absolute undifferentiated unity. That means that he's definitely has to be timeless. In that case, he would lack all temporal relations or dimensions and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it follows. If the medieval notion of divine simplicity is in fact true, then God must be timeless. What about God's immutability? Well, this just means that he's, in the medieval sense, it means that he's absolutely changeless or unchangeable. Impossible that God can change in any respect. He's literally an immobile statue, just sitting there, frozen, for all of eternity. He doesn't have successive thoughts, actions. He never undergoes any trivial alterations of any kind. He doesn't undergo intrinsic nor extrinsic changes in relation to external changing things like us in the universe. We're changing all the time. God's just totally unrelated to us. He cannot relate to us externally because that would entail extrinsic change on God's part. Well, this doctrine says no, he doesn't. God is just totally unrelated to creation at all. And not only that, God never undergoes any intrinsic change. He doesn't have changing thoughts or changing actions or anything like that. So yeah, again, if this is true, then it definitely follows that God must be a timeless God, because once again, God, in terms of his intrinsic, he can't change in his knowledge. He can't know that it is Tuesday today, and then on Thursday he goes, it is Thursday today. Only a temporal God can know those temporal facts. Immutable God can never change intrinsically, so his knowledge could never change. He could never know that today is Tuesday or today is Monday or whatever it is. So yeah, if divine immutability in the medieval sense is true, God is a statue, he's therefore must be timeless. So premise number 2 is absolutely proven, 100% on that front. But now we come to the all-important premise 1 that we've been hinting at, and this is the Achilles heel of the argument and why it's an absolute failure. So as I mentioned before, when it comes to divine simplicity, it's logically absurd to think that God's goodness, for example, is the identical and same as God's power. No, they're different attributes. They are distinguishable, distinct attributes of God, just like his omnipresence, his omniscience. They are internal aspects. They're all essentially united in God's soul, but God has different thoughts. God has different powers. These are all distinct and differentiable, discrete powers or thoughts within God himself, the one united being, God himself. Furthermore, this is biblically ridiculous too, if you believe in the Trinity, as I kind of hinted at above, right? Because God is 3 persons, distinct, discrete, individual peeps or persons, individual sets of cognitive faculties sufficient for personhood, essentially united in one soul or spiritual substance. But nonetheless, this one spiritual substance is complex. It's not simple. It has 3 persons, separate. Now, those aren't dividable. You can't cut out Jesus from the Trinity or something like that. But this definitely, the Bible, not only is divine simplicity, that as in the medieval sense, logically absurd, but it's also biblically absurd too. It denies essential doctrines like the Trinity, and if you deny that, you're going to hell. You're damned. The Bible says that that's an essential doctrine, the divinity of Jesus at the very least. Okay, well, what about divine immutability then? Here again, we have major problems. So, in the first place, metaphysically speaking, I don't think that there is an argument that shows that divine immutability is absolutely incoherent or logically absurd in and of itself. So it doesn't suffer from secular philosophical problems, but it does suffer again from biblical problems in terms of its radical medieval form. And that's because, think of the essential doctrine of the incarnation. Again, you don't believe this, you're going to hell. This is a damnable heresy if you deny Jesus' incarnation. Jesus was God the Son, the second person of the Trinity who became incarnate. He had a divine nature, and then he changed and intrinsically acquired a human nature as well, so that he had both. He didn't always have that. So that is a change that is biblically necessitated, and divine immutability has to deny that God can just change at all. Secondly, it's also absurd to think that, well, God is a theistic God. He's doing miracles. He's answering people's prayers in real time. He's interacting with creation in the Bible all the time. Well, this contradicts the medieval sense of divine immutability, because God can't have external relations to his creation under this doctrine. He's totally unrelated, and that is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is a dynamic, living, interacting, engaging God who cares about the creation and gets his hands dirty, even to the point where he becomes incarnate himself and takes on a human nature and then suffers and dies on the cross for us. Wow, what an amazing God. And it's great. I love the fact that when I pray to him, I'm talking to God in real time. He's listening to me at the very moment I speak my words and talk to him about what's on my mind. So that contradicts divine immutability. It's totally biblically incoherent, and also suffers logically, I think, if you believe that there's evidence that God does in fact interact with his creation. If you have a theistic rather than a deistic concept, that would be problematic for you. Some other philosophers have objected to God's immutability based on the fact that, well, if God's a perfect being, how can he change? You can't change perfection. And you've heard some skeptics. I remember when I was talking with Class Cray, David Johnson kind of raised that issue. But the problem here is that it's not true that something's being perfect doesn't mean that you can't have any change. In the first place, we have to define what we mean by perfect, or that's usually translated as complete in some sense. Okay, well, what sense do you mean? And I have some differences with some other Christian theologians and philosophers that I've been reading and that sort of thing, for example, on that front. But the main point here, regardless of how we define what it means for God to be perfect, it's not true that even if God is absolutely perfect in the complete sense of the definition, that doesn't mean that God can't undergo any change. No, it just means there can't be any vertical change. He can't grow better, or he can't diminish in his status. But he can change laterally or horizontally so that it maintains the perfect overall value, for example. So that's not a problem at all. Lateral or horizontal changes don't violate this. So on that basis, I don't think that this argument's persuasive for divine immutability. I don't think that this proves that divine immutability is true, based on perfect being theology appeals and stuff like that. Now, in that sense, what does the Bible mean then when it talks about God's being unchangeable or non-changing? And it does mention that, right? So in the first place, we have to say, well, the Bible also explicitly says that God changes, he repents and stuff like that. And we say that, well, that's not literal, that's metaphorical, or that's just the Bible using anthropomorphic or anthropopathos, human empathy type things. God always knew providentially what was going to happen. He doesn't repent of anything. He knows what was happening. But it's using human language, a human perspective, to describe God's changing his mind. He said, look, I made you a conditional prophecy, Nineveh. If you don't repent, I'm going to wipe you off the face of the earth. Nineveh repented, so God repented and changed his mind, and he didn't wipe them out. So that's what those verses are obviously talking about if you actually read it and listen to what biblical scholars have to say and let Scripture interpret Scripture. It's fairly obvious that that's what the Bible means. But now the skeptic here will say, okay, well, great. Now, any and all verses that speak of God's changing are meant to be like that, and therefore only the verses that speak of God unchanging proves that he must be all unchanging. Therefore, we get our divine immutability. But that's not true. So biblical scholar J.I. Packer, he actually defines 6 senses, all of the senses in the Bible, where God is said to be unchangeable or does not change. And here's what he gets. So number 1, God is unchanging in his life. He cannot stop existing. He is permanent, eternal. He never begins to exist. He never ceases to exist. There are verses like that all in the Bible. That doesn't mean that he doesn't change. It's just that he can't have his life. He can't change in the sense of having his existence stopped or his life taken. Secondly, God's character does not change. His moral character, his mercy, his love, his faithfulness, his justice, these are all essential to who God is as part of God's inherent divine nature. So these never change. The Bible has several verses about that. Thirdly, God's truth never changes. Lots of verses about that. God's ways do not change. And this allows for the flexibility. Obviously, God deals differently with different people, such as in the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant, and there's progressive revelation. But what J.I. Packer is saying here when he says God's ways do not change is that the ways in which God deals with people or punishes sin is totally consistent. And he's consistent in the way he bestows grace or mercy upon people. So it's not as though God is capricious or changing in an arbitrary sense. Remember, God is no respecter of persons. He doesn't treat his favorites better than others. So that's what it means when the Bible speaks. Verses are talking about God's ways do not change. And if you look up those verses in context, you see that scholar Dr. Packer is absolutely right. Fifthly, God's purposes do not change. His providential plan, consistent with his omniscient foreknowledge of the future and middle knowledge, are guaranteed to come about. And he has no need to change from that overall purpose or plan. It was a perfect plan. It's being accomplished and will be accomplished in the future, totally. Sixth, God's Son does not change. So that's in Hebrews 13:8, for example. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Those are the only 6 senses in which God can be said to be unchangeable in the Bible. But that leaves several respects where God can change. He changes in his knowledge. He changes in his relations with temporal creatures all the time. None of these 6 senses, Bible verses that reflect these 6 senses of God's being unchangeable or not changing, have anything to do with saying, well, God must be a statue. That's not implied in the Bible itself. And in fact, the Bible contradicts that by proving that God does, in fact, change in certain respects outside of these 6 senses of his being non-changeable or unchangeable. So yeah, therefore, on that basis, I think that this argument is a total failure. It's less than 5%. So it's proven beyond reasonable doubt that this argument is a failure and is false because of premise 1. We know that divine simplicity and divine immutability in the medieval sense of the words are proven to be false beyond all reasonable doubt, in my opinion. Okay, so that's it for the first argument. What about the second argument for divine timelessness? And this is the strongest of the 3, and it's basically called the divine incompleteness argument. So how does this one go? So basically, this argument is argued for by philosophers like Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann. I'll be including in the blog source free philosophical papers giving their arguments on this front. Also, Dr. Brian Leftow, who was a Christian philosopher at Oxford University, who took over for Richard Swinburne. I have his book, so I have nothing I can send you guys from Brian Leftow on this. Maybe I can find a paper to post up, but otherwise I was using his book. Chapter 12 of his book, Time and Eternity, deals with God, arguments for God's timelessness. But anyways, they give this argument based on perfect being theology, where God must have, quote-unquote, complete possession all at once of his interminable life. So it's envisioned that, like, if God had to live a temporal life, he's somehow diminished or defective in his existence because he's unable to enjoy on an experiential level the past or the joys of the future. Those are inaccessible to him. Only the present exists if God is temporal, so to speak. So yeah, they basically argue along the lines of the following. So premise 1, God is the most perfect being, and I've qualified that to say that is metaphysically compossible. Premise 2, the most perfect being has the most perfect mode of existence, or I've qualified that, or most perfect mode of existence that is metaphysically compossible to have. By compossible, that just means that it logically or metaphysically possible in light of all the other factors, relevant factors, or all things considered, is what that compossible word means. Premise 3, temporal existence is a less perfect mode of existence than timeless existence. From that, we get subconclusion 1, which is premise number 4. Thus, God has the most perfect mode of existence. And then finally, our main conclusion. Therefore, God has a timeless mode of existence. So I think this is a logically valid argument, commits no logical, formal or informal logical fallacies. So therefore, again, it boils down to, well, are the premises true? And in the first place, I think that the main conclusion definitely follows from the sub-conclusion, as we found out that, the most perfect mode of God has the most perfect mode of existence, and that the timeless, there are only two alternatives, because a temporal existence and a timeless existence is a true dichotomy. So if premise 3 is correct, and a temporal existence is less perfect than a timeless existence, then God must be timeless as a perfect being. So the main conclusion definitely follows from premise 4. Premise 1, God is the most perfect being in a metaphysically compossible way. That's totally controversial. Every Christian theist will probably agree with that or not have a problem. Again, depending on how you define perfect here. And that's why I added the qualification. Premise number 2, the most perfect being has the most perfect mode of existence, or at least the most perfect mode of existence that is metaphysically compossible to have. Fully agree, 100% that premise is proven true. So really it boils down to premise 3. That's the only controversial premise in this argument, that people who believe in divine temporality want to object to this. And that's the premise: temporal existence is less perfect than timeless existence. And there have been several objections to this premise. So the first way is, okay, well, maybe a Christian theist, such as my own pastor, for example, they might say, well, we can appeal to a B theory of time, or a tenseless theory of time, where all of time, the past, present, and future, all exist like a block, and God simultaneously. God exists in that one simultaneous moment, and he can tenselessly relate to all the past, present, and future. So those moments aren't lost. God's experience of reality and creation isn't diminished by losing the past, or diminished because he can't access the future. No, it's all right there, available to him, ontologically speaking. So that's the first attempt to refute premise 3. But unfortunately, that fails. And there's examples, a humorous example, not really humorous, but Albert Einstein, for example, one of his buddies got killed, and he sent a letter to his wife trying to comfort the family by saying, don't worry, he's still alive. He's just at a different temporal coordinate than the one that we're in. Obviously, that didn't help, but this is based on his B theory, Minkowski B theory of time, where past, present, future all exist. No one ever goes out of existence. That Jesus is being crucified right now, literally right now, under this B theory of time, and it's the year 2021, right now. But yeah, so even if this is true, it doesn't work, because even if all of reality, past, present, and future, is ontologically present for God, that still doesn't refute premise 3 of the argument, because premise 3 is really aimed at the experiential, not ontological diminishment. And even if the B theory of time is true, God still loses and acquires portions of his life at various temporal locations, because he experiences, through the experience of temporal becoming or temporal passage, only the present is really experientially now for God. The past is gone experientially, the future doesn't exist experientially. And because based on that experiential lack, God doesn't seem like a perfect being. That's how the person who would retort to someone using the B theory to refute premise 3 in favor of proving God is divinely timeless. Okay, let's try a different approach to refuting premise 3. And it's a more temporally experiential, relevant type counter. And that's basically, we object to premise 3 by saying, well, we can appeal to what psychologists call our quote-unquote specious present. Specious present. Fancy word, what the heck does that mean? Well, it's technical jargon in psychology, where it refers to the subjective conscious awareness of what is quote-unquote now, or the present. For most human beings, this usually entails a mere fraction of a second. I've seen some papers say it's about 2 seconds at most, kind of thing. So in general, humans are within a fraction of a second, 2 seconds, that equals the present, that equals now on a psychological level. That's our conscious awareness of the now. And this is what philosophers call the specious present. And I'll include some papers about this on the blog, so please check that out. Free scholarly sources. But yeah, so basically, how does this objection go? So someone might object to premise 3 based on the specious present and say, well, maybe if someone's specious present is longer, well, then their temporal experience isn't being diminished as they live their temporal life. And maybe with God's specious present actually encompasses the whole of time itself. Therefore, there's no past, present, and future. It's all speciously present to God on a psychological level. And that allows God to be temporal, yet his temporal experience or temporal life is never diminished experientially, because he has it all, he experiences it all at once. Okay, so unfortunately this defeater, while interesting and creative, it simply fails to persuade because it entails devastating and damnable, literally from a Christian theist perspective, damnable implications. You'll go to hell if you believe this, because it's so, or, well, yeah, if you believe the implications that go along with it and understand that there are these implications. But it basically, look, this, what psychologists call the specious present, how does that result? Well, it's because of physical limitations within human beings. Look, the signals from our body to our little brain travel at finite velocity in terms of the transmission of the signals along our nervous system. So if an event happens too quickly in relation to another event, well then, because of the finitude of our nervous system, we will falsely experience that psychologically as both events happening simultaneously in the consecutive present. Meanwhile, ontologically speaking, those are not simultaneous events. That's false belief or false knowledge. We're wrong. They weren't consecutively present. One happened after the other. It just happened so quickly that psychologically we think they're present when they're not. So it makes no sense to think of God experiencing a specious present, an unembodied mind that's not inherent, that's what's the word I'm looking for? That's not privy to physical limitations and the finite velocity of transmission signals in a nervous system. Someone who's omniscient and maximally great, they wouldn't be able to distinguish temporally these discrete events and then would come to false belief, thereby contradicting God's omniscience, that these events were simultaneous and speciously present events. No, God, that's impossible. God could never do that. Otherwise, he's not God. He's not an omniscient God. He's got false knowledge, and he's apparently physical and not spiritual. And in fact, believe it or not, if you take this specious present objection to premise 3, it's even worse. It's even worse because basically this is you conceiving of God as being mentally retarded. He's even worse than a human being by comparison. What? Well, how did you get that? Well, it's because, again, God, remember, it entails the false beliefs of believing two events are present when they're actually not, because psychologically we can't process it quick enough. Well, if this were the case with God, and we are positing that God's specious present is all of time, that means that all of time is speciously present to him, and he can't distinguish. He has a false belief about everything, about when Jesus came, about when this. Retarded in an almost infinite degree. And he would have false beliefs about all temporal events, about when they happen. He would think they all happened at the same time. And it's even worse because he wouldn't even become consciously aware of any and all temporal events or happenings until everything was over, until all of time had happened, and boom, okay, now he's aware of it, because his specious presence span the interval of that is all of time. So we're knowing things, but God doesn't. God's an ignoramus. He literally knows nothing, because he knows ever since time began, God, and time is eternal. And under this view, if we're saying God is temporal, God is eternally temporal instead of divinely timeless. That's people who think that God is eternally temporal are the ones that would object to premise 3 of this divine timeless argument. Well, then that means God doesn't even know that stuff is happening until everything's all over. Don't forget that the future is potentially infinite into the future. It's eternal into the future. So time continues on and on and on and on, approaching the ideal limit of infinity, but never getting there. So God literally knows nothing for all of eternity. I'm smarter than God. God knows nothing. I at least know I've got, my name is Dale, for example, so I'm smarter than God. Ooh, this view is very problematic and downright heresy. If you understand what you're talking about and you affirm it, you're not a saved person, I think. Yeah, again, it gets into other things and other damnable heresies, right? Because once again, God could never know anything or be able to respond to any of the individual events within time until all of time is over, and time is never over. So much for the atonement in past history. God could never have entered into history, been crucified on the cross for our sins, and therefore, as the Apostle Paul tells us, we are still dead in our sins. If you believe this view of God and take this view that God has a specious present that covers all of time itself. So yeah, this is a logically absurd notion. It contradicts what God is, and therefore it can't be true. There is one potential escape route, and that's if you posit divine backward causation. I think that backward causation is ridiculous and false on its own grounds. But yeah, and it's tremendously ad hoc. If you're resorting to backward causation to try and redeem yourself and refute premise 3, I think it's far more obvious that premise 3 is probably true in favor of divine timelessness than that you can defeat premise 3 using this specious present and backward causation to overcome it. That just seems very improbable to me, to my mind, to be true. All right, great. So that's it. So thus far, all the attempts of the proponents of divine temporality to defeat this argument from incompleteness by the divine timelessness proponents, they've utterly failed. And thus we're still left with the fact that premise 3 seems to be intuitively true. A temporal existence does seem to be a less perfect mode of existence than a timeless existence, on the basis of losing or gaining in God's experiential life. So yeah, how can we? What is a successful answer? Is the proponent of divine temporality just done in the water? No, I think that there are successful counters here. So let's get into that. Well, the argument that Dr. William Lane Craig gives is one that we heard with David Johnson in one of the shows that we did, where they appeal to, God has a perfect memory. He's omniscient. He's not like a human, and their faulty memory and finite and stuff like that. God is perfect and all of this. So therefore, the passage of time doesn't diminish God. God's memory of the past, and or through his omniscience and middle knowledge, his anticipation or access to the future. It doesn't matter that it's not actualized, even if it exists in potential form. That's the same experientially. So someone could claim that, but unfortunately, I don't think that this works. And even William Lane Craig admits that no, there does seem to be a difference where the experience is, even if it's just slightly, is better than just having a perfect memory of something. And William Lane Craig is the example of, would it really matter to you if you lost your friend, they died or something like that, but God gave you a perfect memory of that person? No, they're still gone. There's still some experiential loss there. However, I will agree with Dr. Craig that this argument mitigates against the impact of the loss. So it's not as much of a diminishment as it might otherwise be in God's case compared to human beings who have a faulty memory and that sort of thing. Our loss of the past is more grievously felt than a perfect being like God's. But it still doesn't do the trick, and in terms of falsifying premise 3. So in that case, premise 3 can still go ahead. So I went beyond William Lane Craig. This is my own personal argument. Obviously I've been using Dr. William Lane Craig's great book, Time and Eternity, for the structure and framework of this show. So I highly recommend you buy that book. It's an amazing book. But in this case, I felt that William Lane Craig's argumentation wasn't good enough. So I'm adding my own to his list here. And this one, I think, does defeat or provide an equally possible feeder against the truth of premise 3. So yeah, I would say it's at least equally probable, and that's my minimal claim. Therefore, we can't prove God exists timelessly based on this argument. But it basically says, look, I admit, when looking at premise 3 in isolation, there is that diminishment. The loss of the past and the inaccessibility of the future does seem to be an experiential diminishment on God's part when judged in isolation. I don't deny that aspect. I'm giving that to the proponent of divine timelessness here. So they're saying, okay, great, where's the defeater? Well, I think the defeater comes in when we have an all things considered perspective. And when we make that all things considered, there's not a diminishment. It turns out to be equal. Whether God is timeless or temporal in his existence, they're both equally the same, and therefore we can have a lateral change from time. So basically, a way to argue this, some people say, well, look, there are certain benefits that God gets only by being temporal that is impossible for a timeless God to get. For example, appreciating music. And this is something that William Lane Craig mentions as well. He basically says, well, look, in order to appreciate music, you have to be temporal in nature. You can't just experience it all timelessly. It's just a noise, a mess. It's inherent in the enjoyment of music, the richness of the enjoyment of music, to appreciate the temporal sequence of notes being played, leading from one to the next. So a timeless God can't enjoy music. A temporal God can. That's a benefit that a temporal God has. The additional benefit, so is that enough to outweigh the loss and that sort of thing? Well, this isn't the only type of benefit. I also speculate, well, there's the benefit of interacting in a eternally loving relationship with creatures for all of eternity. That's the main purpose why God creates and enters into time. On my view, with Dr. William Lane Craig, as I'll be arguing for later, I think that God was timeless without creation and entered into time at the moment of creation. This kind of shows, so it shows the sacrificial love on God's part, and in a sense, he's sacrificing his perfect completeness of experience, because now once he enters in time, there's a little diminishment, but there's also a benefit on his part, and those outweigh and equal up so that it's perfectly balanced. The net negatives and the net positives equal out, and God is right back overall, in terms of overall utility, as where he started. So a timeless God versus a temporal God are equally perfect in the maximum possible degree, and that's why I added that qualification. You know, the best degree that's possible or logically possible in either situation, and the net benefits and detriments precisely match and equal each other. So therefore, overall, it's just a lateral change. And as we saw, God is perfectly able to do a lateral or horizontal change from one mode, a timeless existence of eternal existence, to a temporal eternal existence. And that doesn't diminish or improve God. He's perfect as timeless, he's perfect as temporal on that front. So that's my solution that William Lane Craig doesn't give, but that I've added here, that I think provides an equally possible defeater to the truth of premise 3. And since the burden of proof is on the proponent of the argument, the divine timelessness, to prove that premise number 3 is true in order for their argument to be successful, they have to defeat this defeater, and they can't do that. So in that case, yeah, I don't think we can say that this argument is able to prove that God must exist in a divinely timeless thing. It's either or. It could be either or. Both are equally perfect. So I give it a 50% proven on this level. It could be true, it could be false. I'm kind of agnostic about whether this argument based on God's incompleteness or imperfection can really tell us whether God, the mode of God's eternality, whether it's timeless or temporal. I don't think it can work there. But yeah, okay, cool. And just one last addendum argument here. This is based on God's motivation for creating. So if you say that God is temporal for all of it, infinite past or eternal past, a lot of atheists will come up and object and say, well, why would God, if he's everlastingly past eternal, why did he only create the universe 13.8 billion years ago? Wasn't he bored, or, you know, like what possible reason does he have for creating it only at that time? And they say this makes God seem like he's diminished or weird or something like that. So in the first place, Christian scholars argue against this. Like, if you go to the Closer to Truth series, there's a lot of famous Christian philosophers who address this and say, "Oh, this is just rubbish. God is a perfect being. He never gets bored, and all of that. And he was waiting to create until the perfect time. There was nothing. There was no diminishment without creation overall in terms of overall utility of God just existing everlastingly without creation. He doesn't need creation in any sense. So it was a total free will decision, and he just happened to choose to freely create the universe 13.8 billion years ago. There was no need on God's part to create at that time as opposed to another time. He just freely chose to do it at that time. So that's kind of the answer if you want to postulate that God is eternally temporal through all of eternity. Or there's the other way, and this is the way that I argue, and following William Lane Craig, that God is timeless without creation. Therefore, this entire objection or question is totally irrelevant because there is no, before the universe existed. The universe came into existence simultaneously at the moment that God caused the universe to come into existence. That was the start of all of time. So there is no moment of time before time, so to speak here, right? So yeah, God is timeless without creation and is temporal with creation, or at the precise temporal moment that creation comes into existence, caused by God. So that's the solution, and that just totally destroys this atheistic argument about, oh, well, why did God only create 13.8 billion years ago and stuff like that? Because that's when time began. Without time, God was timeless. It's not like he was waiting around for an eternity of temporal intervals and stuff, and years and years and years, and okay, 13.8 billion years ago, God is like, okay, time to create. That's not what my notion about God's eternality envisions, neither Dr. William Lane Craig's. But like I said, even if you do go for that line in terms of God's mode of eternality is being temporally past, so there is a before the universe, there is a temporal moment past infinity, an actual infinite of past eternal moments, if you believe that, which contradicts our cosmological argument proper, so it can't be true, but let's just pretend for the sake of argument that it is true. Or perhaps God exists in a hypertime or an undifferentiated or amorphous time dimension. So amorphous time would avoid the impossibility of an actual infinite from our cosmological argument because it's not quantitative in nature. There is no metric time, 1 hour, 1 hour before that, 1 hour before that, and so on. Undifferentiated or amorphous or amorphous time, it doesn't suffer from this objection either. It can answer this question of the atheist because, once again, it's not like God was, okay, I'm here for an hour before that, an hour before that, then another hour, and then finally 13.8 billion years ago, it's like, okay, I'm creating this hour. The objection is just totally irrelevant. So there's a few ways Christian theists can respond to this kind of objection. And that's irrespective of whether you believe God was temporal or God was timeless. It just depends on how you define temporal. You have to go with some kind of undifferentiated, non-metric notion of time or some kind of amorphous time, and then you're off the hook. You don't have to worry about this kind of thing, and you avoid the problem of the actual infinite. Or you can go with a hypertime or metric time conception. You'll obviously be false because that would entail a quantitative actual infinite, which is logically impossible and contradictory given what we argued in part 1 of our cosmological argument, and or part 2 as well in terms of forming an actual infinite through successive addition. But at least you can respond to this specific objection by saying, well, God doesn't get bored, he didn't need creation, he just happened to freely choose to create at that time as opposed to any other time. There's no reason for it. So yeah, there's at least those 3 solutions. Like I said, God doesn't get bored, it was a free will decision, so God created there. That's if you take a metric conception of time for past infinity, but that violates the fact that actual infinites can't exist. Or you can say God is temporal, but it's in an undifferentiated or amorphous dimension of time, so that means it's not metrical, it's not broken up into intervals, it's not a quantitatively divisible dimension of time. Or you can take my route. God is timeless without creation and only is temporal with creation. At the temporal moment where the universe begins to exist. Yeah, so that's great. So let's get into the third argument then. So this is going to be a bit of a doozy. And we kind of handled this already in part 2 of our cosmological argument series, but it basically says, well, based on the special theory of relativity, divine timelessness must be true. So how does this argument work? Okay, so as we saw, in terms of how the argument from relativity, or specifically the special theory of relativity, is what we have in mind here. So if you remember, in part 2 of my cosmological argument, or on pages 44 to 50 in my cosmological argument chapter, that 220-page chapter that's for free on my blog, you can go and read what I've written there. We kind of went into the argument from relativity for the nature of time within creation for the universe. Is it an A theory of time, a tensed theory of time, or is it a B theory of time, the tenseless theory of time that applies to the creation, applies to the universe? And there is that difference between the Minkowski interpretation of space-time, the B theory, versus the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of the special theory of relativity, which allowed for the A theory of time. So again, go back to part 2 and to get specific details, but just to quickly summarize here. So essentially, the data of relativity came out in the 19th century. It started looking like the speed of light was constant, and this was problematic. How do we interpret this? Because from time immemorial, since Newton, Galileo, they all knew about relativity, but they posited a difference between relative time and absolute time. There is an absolute time, and that's God's time. Or in the 19th century, some famous physicists equated that with the ether, a scientifically falsified concept, but nonetheless, there is this ether, and that's the ether time. That's the grand, universal, absolute standard of time. It provides for absolute simultaneity. Two events can happen at the same time, absolutely. And that sort of thing. And this kind of messed up some mathematical equations, and was, with the Michael Morsley experiment, was becoming problematic because it looked like light was constant. So Henrik A. Lorentz was a famous physicist who interpreted this as, well, look, no, there's this privileged absolute universal time, and light actually isn't constant, despite the fact that we measure it to be constant with our scientific instruments. That's a trick. It's an illusion, because distances and the devices themselves are altered based on one's motion. The faster you approach the speed of light, the more distorted those objects' things. So clocks shrink, or measurement devices will contract or shrink, thereby making us have the illusion that light is the same, but it's actually the distances themselves that are actually varying with one's speed, ontologically speaking. And this was the interpretation, the Lorentzian interpretation of relativity. A rather brilliant suggestion. Now, Albert Einstein, on the other hand, hated Lorentz's idea. He hated any notion of there being some kind of privileged reference or inertial frame. He wanted everything to be purely relative. So he kind of asserted and assumed, without any proof whatsoever, and everyone in the world agrees that Albert Einstein was just biased because he had suffered from a philosophy of his day called verificationism. And unfortunately for Einstein, that has just been destroyed in recent years. Nobody believes in it. It's laughed at today. But back then, it was very popular, and he was a product of his time. He just mindlessly believed that verificationism was true, and therefore he asserted and assumed, with zero proof whatsoever, that there was no privileged time frame that God or an ether could exist in, or something like that. No privileged inertial frame. It's all relative to your motion and that sort of thing. So that's sort of the contrast there, right? So the only notion, there is no notion of absolute simultaneity. The only simultaneity that exists is, well, if you're able to synchronize your time measuring devices with each other within a single inertial frame. So that's sort of the contrast there. We went over that in part 2, why that's Einstein's view doesn't work compared to the neo-Lorentzian interpretation of the special theory of relativity. But rather than using the special theory of relativity and applying that to, well, what's the nature of the temporal universe? Is it an A theory or B theory? One could also, a proponent of divine timelessness can also adopt the special theory of relativity and make an argument that, well, God must be timeless based on this data. So how would they go about doing this? So they can give a logically deductive argument as follows. Premise 1, the Einsteinian special theory of relativity, or STR for short, is the correct description of time. Premise 2, if STR is in fact correct in its description of time, and if God is temporal, then he exists either in the time associated with a single inertial frame, so that single uniform motion, or he exists in the times, plural, associated with a plurality of inertial frames. Those are the only two options. That it's a dichotomy that's presented. God, if STR is correct, and if God is said to be temporal, well, these are the only two ways he could exist temporally in the light of the special theory of relativity. He's with it. God is solely within one single inertial frame, or he's in a plurality of inertial frame, the times associated with a plurality of inertial frames. Okay, so from that we get our first sub-conclusion, which serves as premise 3. So thus, if God is temporal, he must exist either in the time associated with a single inertial frame, or the times, plural, associated with a plurality of inertial frames. That follows logically necessary from the first two premises. So that's the third premise. Then we submit premise 4. Premise number 4 says God does not exist in either the time associated with a single inertial frame or the times associated with a plurality of inertial frames. Therefore, our main conclusion logically follows from the truth of the premises that God is not temporal, and via logical equivalence, remember, God's being temporal is logically contradictory with God's being timeless, meaning if God's not temporal, then that automatically proves that God is timeless. He's non-temporal or timeless. So that's how the argument would work in premise format in a nutshell there. Now, what do we say by way of assessment? Well, in the first place, premise number 1 is obviously false. The Einsteinian special theory of relativity, or STR, is not correct in its description of time. Very probably, or at the very least, probably not correct in its description of time. So this is obviously the Achilles heel of the argument, the immediate one at face value at least. And as we discussed in the Cosmological Argument proper, in the Part 2 show, or on pages 44 to 50 in my book, Cosmological Argument chapter, there was no valid reason presented by Einstein to privilege the Einsteinian interpretation over the neo-Lorentzian interpretation of the special theory of relativity. They're both empirically equivalent, and everybody agrees with this today. Virtually no one denies this. They are, scientifically speaking, exactly equal at minimum, kind of thing. Now, as you saw in Part 2 of my Cosmological Argument, atheists and skeptics will sometimes present philosophical reasons in addition to the empirical data from the special theory of relativity, and they'll attach those philosophical arguments to try and argue for the B theory of time in relation to our universe. You know, we refuted all of that and shown that those all fail, they're nonsense, they don't work. So therefore, it's empirically speaking, and we can't tell the nature of the universe. Essentially here, we can't say that the special theory of relativity allows us empirically to say one way or the other. The only way that Einstein's interpretation of the special theory of relativity could be favored is if one assumes that verificationism is true. And that's a self-refuting. It's logically impossible for that to be true. And as I said, everybody, atheist, Christian, doesn't matter, they laugh at you if you think that this is true. Now, there are some popularizers of science, like Richard Dawkins. He might believe that something like verificationism, or Lawrence Krauss or something like that. They're not sophisticated when it comes to logic and philosophy, and it shows. So you get these popularistic atheists that don't know what they're talking about, that might still adopt verificationism, but it's logically impossible to be true. You are literally laughed at by everyone in the know, whether atheist or not, if you propose verificationism. But back in Einstein's day, they didn't know any better. They were ignorant, so they kind of were brainwashed into believing that this is the case, and so that was the fundamental basis on which Einstein's interpretation was favored. But yeah, no physicist today in the know, or philosopher or logician in the 21st century would go for that. It's an outmoded idea, and it's self-refuting. It cannot be true. So therefore, we have no basis for privileging Einstein versus the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of the special theory of relativity in terms of the proper description of time. However, it gets worse for premise one, because remember how I said, well, the two theories are empirically equivalent? Well, actually, no. We have empirical scientific evidence and data and proof that shows that the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation is superior to Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity interpretation. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about quantum entanglement. That proves, at the very least on a balance of probabilities, empirically, that the Neo-Lorentzian view is true, is probably true. And that's the Neo-Lorentzian view does posit absolute time. So it restores the notion of a privileged inertial frame, a privileged reference frame, that one could argue, well, that's God's time. Therefore, God's time is the preferred basis for all of the localized times, or the measured times and stuff like that. It differentiates between absolute time and metric time, where we use our devices or clocks to measure time. It absolutely restores the distinguishing between this. So yeah, basically what am I referring to? So there's this monumental sea change. In 1964, John Bell, the scientist of Bell's theorem level fame, proved that quantum entanglement was true. And this totally refuted Albert Einstein, who had a bet back in the 1930s against Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr turned out to be right. Einstein was wrong. And the problem with quantum entanglement is that, well, these particles are too far for light to have communicated between them. Therefore, there couldn't be a causal relation between the two. But yet, whatever you do to the one thing happens to the other thing, and it affects them equally. So that's impossible, according to Einstein. But nonetheless, it's a scientifically proven fact beyond all reasonable doubt that quantum entanglement is in fact true. And that proves that either one has to postulate some kind of faster than light causal influences, or you have to hold that particles are somehow non-causally correlated to each other. And that would have to be done in a way that's instantaneous, thereby restoring absolute simultaneity across differing inertial frames. So Bell himself kind of radically changed his mind, and said that we have to now seriously consider the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of the data from relativity, and restore the privileged ether, or for us as theists, it would be the God time. God's time is the privileged absolute time of the duration of the entire universe, and it seems to be backed up empirically by these data. What's more, the plausibility of positing an absolute time as God's time was even further substantiated when we found out about the CMB, or cosmic microwave background radiation, because that almost seems to kind of echo with the outdated and falsified notion of the ether time that Henrik Lorentz himself posited back in the 1800s. Obviously, the ether is false, but maybe the CMB is something like that. It allows us to distinguish a universal, absolute resting inertial frame through which the Earth and things move and that sort of thing. But it provides a plausibility for the notion of a universal or absolute rest, absolute resting inertial frame relative to everything else that's moving. So once again, that restores the notion. Well, God can have time, God can have absolute rest with respect to space and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's important to note that none of this proves logically that God is in fact temporal rather than timeless. That the data here is just suggestive and speaks to the plausibility and or slight probability of the Lorentzian view. But the truth of the Lorentzian view doesn't prove absolutely that God is timeless or temporal in any case. So I don't want you to be confused and try to use, oh, well, John Bell, because we have quantum entanglement, God must be temporal. That proves it. That's not entailed with absolute certainty from this at all. We get absolute simultaneity through quantum entanglement, so there is absolute simultaneity outside of inertial reference frames. That's from the John Bell and the quantum entanglement. And also we get absolute rest from the CMB data, the plausibility of a state of absolute rest relative to all other localized inertial frames and that sort of thing. That's really what's proven here, and that favors the Neo-Lorentzian view, or at the very least speaks to its equal possibility or probability. And if it's equally probable or more probable than not, then that falsifies premise 1 that the Einsteinian interpretation of STR is the correct description of time. No, it looks like it's equally probable, minimally, or more probable than not that the Neo-Lorentzian view or interpretation of the theory, the relativity data that applies to uniform notion in the special theory of relativity is true, is the correct description of time. That's more probable, or at the very least equally probable to the Einstein interpretation. And since we've established that, premise 1 is defeated, you cannot provide the warrant for the truth of that premise, the argument falls apart. So the main point here is I want to get through to you is that, look, the fact is premise 1 can't be proven to be true. At best, it's equally probable that a Neo-Lorentzian view or interpretation of relativity is true. Therefore, this argument fails. You can't use it to try and prove that God must be timeless. Okay, what about the rest of the argument? How did the other premises do? So let's skip premise 2 for a second and look at, well, sub-conclusion, the first sub-conclusion, or premise number 3. Well, that's a conclusion that follows logically and inevitably from the truth of premises 1 and 2. Obviously, we've seen that premise 1 can't be proven true, but if it were true, then this premise is true. Thus, if God is temporal and STR is true, then he exists either in the time associated with the single inertial frame or the times associated with a plurality of inertial frames, all of those local times. So yeah, that would absolutely follow, contingent on the truth of premises 1 and 2. Premise 4, God does not exist in either the time associated with a single inertial frame or the times associated with a plurality of inertial frames. Well, this premise seems absolutely true. No reason to reject it, because remember we saw, look, if God existed in a single inertial frame, then he's no longer God. He's not causally connected to anything outside of that inertial frame. He can't be sustaining the universe in existence outside of his inertial frame. Whatever uniform motion speed he's traveling at, he can only affect or relate to things in that inertial frame. He can't relate to things that are faster or sustain them in existence. So that's obviously logically absurd. He can't know anything. He's totally ignorant, as we saw. That's totally rubbish. So that God cannot exist in the time associated with a single inertial frame. Likewise, what about the local times, plural, associated with the plurality of inertial frames? Well, once again, that makes God a schizo. He's in all local times, they're not causally connected to each other. Half of his brain is in this inertial frame, another half, 1/3 of his brain is in this thing, another third, of his consciousness is kind of irrevocably split and into various inertial frames that make, that doesn't make any sense. That makes more sense polytheism, rather than a monotheism model. So yeah, I think premise 4 is absolutely proven to be true. No problem with that. And obviously the main conclusion follows logically and necessarily. Therefore, God is not temporal, and through logical equivalence, he's timeless. That absolutely follows given the truth of these premises. So the only objections we saw, well, premise 1 can't be proven to be true. But what about premise 2? We skipped over that one. And premise 2 says, well, if Einstein's special theory of relativity is the correct description of time, we know that it's not, but let's pretend it is, if that's the case, and if you posit that God is temporal, not timeless, well, then that entails this dichotomy. He either exists in the local time associated with a single inertial frame, or he exists in all of the local times associated with the plurality of all inertial frames. Those are the only two choices. So, do we think that this premise based on a dichotomy is true or not? And I would say no. I think we reject not just premise one, but premise two. This is a false dichotomy. It's not the case that these are the only two options, even if we assume God is temporal and that Einstein's special theory of relativity interpretation is correct. So how do I get to this? So in the first place, it has to, let's, even pretending that the Einstein's theory of special theory of relativity is correct, it has a very limited scope. It only applies to uniform motion. That's it. The relativity there only applies to things with uniform motion. It does not apply to other types of non-uniform motion. Accelerated motion or decelerating motion, rotational motion, nothing about those. And obviously those occur in the universe. So yeah, it's not, even if STR is correct about uniform motion, well, you can't extrapolate and say, well, that proves that it gives the correct description of time altogether for everything in the universe, including accelerated motions or rotational motions and stuff like that. No, that's just beyond the explanatory scope of STR, or the special theory of relativity, altogether. So on that basis alone, premise 2 fails. But it gets even worse, because Einstein himself proved that his interpretation of the special theory of relativity is wrong and not to be not correct. Because when he applied accelerated motion and rotational motion and incorporated this into his work on the general theory of relativity, which actually was nothing of the sort. That's kind of a misnomer. It's really just a theory about gravity or gravitation. That's all it turned into, because he tried his best to make this grand thing, but failed, and realized that he was an utter failure and that his STR interpretation must be wrong because of his work on GTR, the general theory of relativity. So basically, GTR entails the existence of an absolute universal time called cosmic time. And this measures the entire universe in all of its local times as a whole. So it's absolute. It's not relative when you include accelerated and rotational motion. It's necessary that you have this cosmic time. And Arthur Eddington kind of described it this way. He said, look, you can have this stack of papers and pretend you have a cartoon drawing on each of the papers in this stack or block of papers. In order for the temporal flow to work and you to see the cartoon, get the illusion of its, Mickey Mouse is moving or something like that, you have to slice the pages up equally in a specific foliation method. That's a proper method in order to get that illusion. If you slice up the papers unequally, you just get a blurry blob or a mess, right? And it's the same with the foliation of space-time, is what they're saying. There has to be this universal cosmic time that's lined up with the certain natural symmetries of the geometry of the universe in order to allow for temporal passage and becoming, even if you think it's an illusion, you're a B theorist of time, the fact is there is this temporal asymmetry, and there's this illusion, at least, of temporal passage or becoming. And in order to get that, there has to be some privileged state, cosmic time, that lines up with these certain natural symmetries to produce the effect of linear temporal history in the universe. Otherwise, you're just going to get that mess, just like with the cartoons. If you're slicing diagonally or slicing different widths and stuff like that, you're not going to get that coherent flowing cartoon. So that was the famous scholar Arthur Eddington's analogy to explain why GTR necessarily implies, even Albert Einstein himself admits this, there has to be a universal, absolute cosmic time. So GTR refutes STR. The general theory of relativity falsifies what the special theory of relativity tried to establish, that there is no, everything is relative. There is no absolute or simultaneity, no absolute time, nothing like that. Sorry, you're wrong. Albert Einstein himself proved that you're wrong if you say this as a skeptic. Um, so yeah, cosmic time. So how does this relate to the truth of premise two and God's role? So obviously, as I said, premise two presents us with a false dichotomy. Either God exists in a single, in the time associated with a single inertial frame, or in the multiple local times, plural, of the plurality of all localized inertial frames. Well, there's two other options here. Number one, thanks to GTR, now we can say, well, maybe God exists in cosmic time itself. He's in that cosmic dimension that's universally the basis, the absolute or ultimate basis for all other local times. You know, you have this non-local causal time, and God exists in that. So that's a third option that this premise doesn't include, and could still allow for God to be temporal, not result in him having to be timeless. Or a fourth option emerges. So let's pretend that cosmic time is just another metrical dimension of time. It's a measure of time, but it isn't time itself. So there is this higher dimension of time, this absolute time or duration of the universe, and that's an undifferentiated time or an amorphous time. And God exists in that. Cosmic time is just the measured or metrical version reflecting that absolute time that God exists in. So there are four options here, two of which still allow for God to be temporal and don't result in the absurdities that the original two in the dichotomy result in. So therefore, the point is you're not forced to resort to saying, well, the only way to escape these absurdities given relativity data or the relativity theory is to say, well, God must be timeless. No, God could be timeless. God could exist in cosmic time, metrical cosmic time, or God could exist in an amorphous or undifferentiated temporal dimension, of which cosmic time is just a measure of that, or reflecting that. So you have three possible options here, and two of which allow for God to be temporal, only the one of which says that God's timeless. So because the proponent of divine timelessness can't prove that you have to go to the timeless option, given these two other additional temporal options that you have on the table, this argument fails. It doesn't work as an argument. So yeah, that's it. So all right, cool. So that covers it. Let's move on next to putting the shoe on the other foot. What are some three arguments that allege to prove that God must be temporal, eternally temporal? He's not timeless, or was never timeless. He was always temporal for eternity past. What are some arguments that people give for God's temporality? Okay, so the first argument that we're going to go over here for divine temporality is based on the impossibility of atemporal or timeless personhood. Essentially, it basically says, well, look, it's impossible, inherently impossible, for someone to be a person or a personal being. In the case of the Trinity, he's a tri-personal being, to have the essential properties of personhood and yet be divinely timeless. That's an impossibility. And so on that front, this is an argument that God is essentially timeless. He can't be temporal throughout all of eternity. It's impossible. It's impossible for God to be timeless because he's essentially a person. So he has to be temporal throughout all of eternity past. He's everlasting. He's not timelessly eternal. And the argument put in deductive form would go as follows. Premise 1, necessarily, if God is timeless, then he does not have any of the requisite personal properties entailed by personhood. Premise 2, necessarily, if God does not have the requisite personal properties entailed by personhood, then God is not personal or a person. Premise 3, necessarily, God is personal. That's inherent in the definition of what God is, and it's a part of his essence. He is essentially personal. Definitely if you're a Christian theist, you're going to believe this, or a traditional theist of any sort, God is definitely personal. That's non-negotiable. Well, therefore, if these three premises are true, the main conclusion follows, God necessarily is not timeless, and through logical equivalence, that must mean he is temporal throughout all of eternity, and temporal by essence. Okay, so this is a valid argument. All the premises are true. And as we said, premise 3, in terms of logical soundness of this deductive argument, premise 3 is absolutely true. You cannot deny that, unless you have some weird definition of God that doesn't pertain to, that's relevant to traditional theists or Christians or something like that. Who cares about them? We're granting premise 3 here. So really it all comes down, what about premise 2? Well, premise 2 is also absolutely proven true. It's unassailable that if God doesn't have the requisite personal properties entailed by personhood, then he's not personal. He's not a person. If he doesn't have the properties of the necessary properties for being a person, then he's not a person. And or just change that to be personal, because again, God is a trinity. He's tri-personal. So he doesn't have the personal properties, rather than properties of being one single person. Yeah, premise 2 is absolutely true. So really all we can reject here is premise number 1 if we're going to argue that God is in fact timeless. So basically that says, well, if God is timeless, then he does not have any of the requisite personal properties essential for personhood. Okay, well that's what the proponent of divine timelessness is going to have to reject if they want to say that God exists timelessly. And on this front, there have been a few objections to this. So in the first place, Daniel Dennett, or Dan Dennett, the famous atheist of the four horsemen of the, those new atheist types, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Dan Dennett. And he's kind of an expert in the philosophy of mind and that sort of thing. And he says, look, in his article, there's a list of 6 necessary characteristics or conditions for someone to be a person. These are the properties you need to have, according to Dennett, in order to be considered a person and or a personal being. In the case of God, if you're tri-personal. So what are these? So number 1, an individual P has to be a rational being. Secondly, the being in question has to have states of consciousness attributed to it. Number 3, others can regard or this being as having states of consciousness attributed to it. Number 4, P is capable of regarding others as beings to which states of consciousness can be attributed to it. That one, sorry solipsis, you're not a person according to Daniel Dennett there, but that's an aside. Okay, so number 5, you also have to be capable of verbal communication. And then finally 6, P is self-conscious. So that is to say that P is capable of regarding himself or herself as a subject of states of consciousness. I am the I that's having these states of consciousness, so to speak. So with these 6 necessary requirements, Daniel Dennett says you're a peep, you're a person, or you're a personal being. And, a timeless God would necessarily lack these things. So therefore, a timeless God could not be a person. It's impossible for them to be a person because they would lack one or more of these necessary qualities. Now, interestingly, the philosopher John Lucas, he's argued that consciousness inherently involves changes and that sort of thing. So sort of focusing on number 2 in the first place, so that you're a being that's capable of states of consciousness in and of itself. So, and he says, well, no, a timeless being is not capable of consciousness or having states of consciousness attributed to it inherently, because states of consciousness involves changes, and changes require temporality. Now the problem here is John Lucas provides no reasons to think that this is true, that consciousness necessarily requires change in order to have it. There's nothing logically or metaphysically impossible about positing a changeless consciousness at all. So I think that John Lucas's argument just fails. It's just a mere assertion, and there's no reason to think that it's true. Another philosopher of time, Richard M. Gale, he's kind of tried to plug that void left by John Lucas by arguing, well, consciousness is inherently a temporally elongated process. So that would be impossible for a timeless divine mind to instantiate, right? Because there is no temporal elongation for a timeless God or timeless mind. There's no temporal extension. Remember, there's two dimensions: temporal location and temporal extension. Well, they're saying, well, consciousness requires temporal extension in order to exist here. But once again, even with Richard Gale's argument here, there's nothing to suggest that it's impossible for a timeless God to know unchanging truths, or to be conscious of unchanging truths, such as the entire multiplication table, for example, and that doesn't require a temporally elongated process or temporal extension in order to have that. And it doesn't require what Gale calls a quote-unquote a disposition to engage in temporal activity. This doesn't seem to be the case. A timeless, omniscient God would know all of these things just automatically at the same moment, just eternally, simultaneously. There isn't a need for a process that it requires temporal extension. And the main issue here, even if we take Gale's complaint here seriously, even if it's true that these things are required and temporal elongated processes are required to be conscious, this argument fails to distinguish between an essential property versus a mere accidental or contingent, or what William Lane Craig calls a common property of consciousness. So God could be disposed or capable of all of these, of changing and that sort of thing, given a temporal mode of existence, even though he's not, as a factually timeless God, he's not doing that. As a matter of fact, he's still capable of it. So he has that capability. It's just a contingent fact that he's not engaging in temporally extended processes. But he still is capable of it, and therefore he would be considered conscious. So yeah, what about the other? So that takes care of the main criterion that a timeless God, could be conscious. So yeah, Dennett's condition number 2 seems like it can be easily met there. Okay, what about condition 3? Well, this is basically where we're saying, well, others will regard a timeless God as a being of which states of consciousness can be attributed. Well, that seems to be automatically fulfilled. I mean, right now, you and me, if you accepted my response to condition 2, then we are the others, and we've accepted, yep, God could have states of consciousness attributed to him, even if he's timeless. So condition 3 is met. What about Dennett's condition 4? And that's where it says, well, he's capable of regarding others as beings that have states of consciousness. Yup, a timeless God can do that. He would be capable of regarding others as being conscious, given that they exist. If they were to be actualized, then he would regard those other beings as having states of consciousness. And again, in order to create these other beings, yes, we're going to be arguing that it's necessary for God to enter into time. He can't be timeless with respect to others actually existing, other conscious beings actually existing. But nevertheless, don't forget that difference between an essential property and a contingent property. So God has the contingent property of fulfilling this condition, even though it's not essential to him being a person to have this. He can switch modes. It's contingent, whether he's timeless or whether he's temporal. If he's temporal, then he can, because he creates other conscious beings, yeah, God's fully capable of considering those beings capable of having states of consciousness attributed to them. Okay, what about condition 5? Well, yeah, once again, God would be perfectly capable of verbal communication. With condition 6, so this is an interesting one. This is, so he must be self-conscious, capable of being regarding himself as a subject of states of consciousness. He is an I, and yeah, we can imagine timeless God being self-conscious. He can imagine, if he can do true propositions as an omniscient being, he knows all true propositions. So that includes third-person propositions. God is timeless. He also knows convert that to the first-person perspective. I am timeless. I am God. There's nothing that would prevent a timeless God from timelessly knowing those true propositions timelessly. So condition 6 can easily be met. Okay, finally we come to criterion 1. So this is, and it's important to note with the self-conscious criterion, the fulfillment of this alone is not just a necessary criterion for personhood, it's a sufficient condition for personhood. If we can, so since we can prove that a timeless God can be self-conscious, that proves that God is a person, irrespective of the other criterions. You don't need them. Just this criterion being fulfilled alone proves that a timeless God could be a person. It's a sufficient condition, according to most philosophers, and I agree with them, philosophers of mind. Okay, but what about the criterion 1? So that's that you have to be considered a rational being. I can't see any reason why a timeless God who's omniscient couldn't be a rational being. I mean, there's nothing about being timeless that impairs God's cognitive or noetic faculties. There's nothing about timelessness that would interfere with God's ability to discharge his intellectual and epistemic duties, for example. So he would be as an omniscient God, he's automatically a totally rational God, and therefore a rational being. He knows all timeless truths of the timeless world in that eternal, simultaneous moment, timelessly. So yeah, this just fails. However, some philosophers like Robert Coburn, for example, have taken this criterion and expanded upon it, along with the self-conscious part. And they said, well, it's not possible for a timeless God to be a rational, self-conscious being. And the reason is because in order to do that, you have to take part in certain temporal activities. You have to engage in remembering, anticipating, reflecting, deliberating, deciding, intending, and acting intentionally. And all of these activities inherently involve temporal extension, or it's a temporal process, is Coburn's argument there. So what do we say by response? Well, in the first place, it just doesn't seem to be the case that in order to be self-conscious and rational, you have to engage in all of the above listed qualities. This just seems to be begging the question here in favor of divine temporality, because look, in order to be self-conscious and that sort of thing, why would you have to remember anything or anticipate anything? A timeless God, there is no future yet to come to anticipate. There is no past to remember. Everything is just eternally present for the timeless God. So these things aren't required to be rational or self-conscious. It would be irrational for God, when he is timeless and he's in the timeless eternal present, to anticipate a future that there is no future yet to be, or a past that's faded from existence. There is no such past that's ever faded from existence in this timeless world. So that just doesn't make sense. Same with deliberating and deciding. God's omniscient. He's already deliberate. There is no deliberation process for God. There's no deciding. It's already decided from eternity past. God already knows what to do, kind of thing. He's known eternally, I'm going to create, and he does it at this, and he does it, right? So that doesn't apply. You're still rational, even if you don't have to go through a process of deliberating where God, will I create or not? Okay, I've decided to create. Click, let there be light. No, that's ridiculous. Okay, what about intending? Well, once again, a timeless God, there is no future to intend to do something. As an omniscient God, already decided eternally, in that eternal moment, that he's going to create and that sort of thing. And the action takes place simultaneously in terms of creation. Remember, it's that simultaneous causation notion. The moment God causes the universe to exist is the moment that the universe, first temporal moment that the universe does in fact exist, that time itself comes into being. So I don't think that Coburn's argument here, or list of qualifications, is necessary or essential for a being to be rational and therefore considered a person or personal being. I think his argument just fails, and therefore it can be shown that a timeless God can have all the requisite qualities of a rational being. Now, one last final objection that skeptics try to bring up is that in order to be a person or personal being, you have to stand in interpersonal relationships, and these require time. You stand in the relation of affecting somebody else, or loving somebody else, and that they love you, and that sort of thing. So a timeless God is alleged they're not able to do that or stand in any interpersonal relationships. However, this fails. So in the first place, God, again, it fails to distinguish between an essential property versus a contingent property. God does have the property or capacity, given a temporal world and temporal creatures, of loving and affecting them and standing in interpersonal relationships with them. So he would succeed in fulfilling this criterion, even if in fact, as a timeless God, he doesn't stand in any interpersonal relationships, simply because he hasn't created anything to have relationships with. However, don't forget, with God as the Christian God, that's the Trinity. There are three divine people or persons that have interpersonal, eternal, interpersonal, timeless relationships with each other. And it's inherently and essentially related to each other within the single soul or being, the Godhead. This perfectly solves. There's nothing, you don't need to have that relationship take place in time or change or anything. It can just be timelessly perfect. And this is a doctrine that the early Greek church fathers, like John of Damascus, talked about. The doctrine of, in Greek, parachoresis. Teddy will probably know what that means, but basically it just talks about the deep interpenetration and intimacy shared by the three God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, and these deep-seated interrelations of their wills, where they affect and are responsive to each other in this perfect timeless moment. And this is perfectly logical and coherent. I mean, we can picture this happening such a relationship happening changelessly and timelessly, because picture an interrelationship between magnets and a bunch of metal filing chips or something like that, metal filings or whatever. They could be timelessly and eternally in an interrelationship where the magnet is attracting, affecting, prompting these filings, and these filings in turn are responsive to the magnet's influences timelessly for all of eternity. It's never changes. There's changelessly affecting and responding to one another in a interrelationship, and there's nothing incoherent about that. Well, it's the same with the Trinity's relationship, this deep-seated, interwoven, timeless relationship that they have, where they're intimately bound and interpenetrating, in terms of their wills and that sort of thing within the Godhead as a timeless existence. So yeah, I think that this fails. No, a timeless God could engage in deep interpersonal relationships, at the very least, even without creation or temporal creatures. The Trinity, if you believe in the Christian Trinity, that proves that a timeless God could be a personal being that has interpersonal relationships eternally and timelessly. So yeah, I think that this argument, trying to prove that God must be temporal, essentially temporal, fails. I gave it 10% proven or less. As we get into the next final two arguments for divine temporality, we have to understand this first argument, based on the impossibility of being a timeless person, was an argument attempting to show the essential impossibility of God being anything other than timeless. Of God being timeless, and therefore that he must be inherently a person. It's impossible for a personal God to be timeless, and that failed. But that isn't to say that God can't be timeless and temporal in different senses. So, for example, the next two arguments are going to be saying, well, let's not consider God an abstract, God without creation. We can't prove either way, it seems, whether he's timeless or temporal without creation. But what about with creation itself? Let's assume that a temporal creation exists, temporal beings like humans and that sort of thing exist. Okay, are there any arguments, given that there's a temporal creation, that can prove one way or the other whether God is timeless or temporal? The answer is yes. We have two arguments that prove God must be temporal with a temporal creation. He could be either temporal or timeless in some sense without creation. We can't tell from the arguments given so far, one way or the other. But with creation, the next two arguments are allegedly going to prove that we know God must be temporal, at least with a temporal creation. Okay, so let's get into that. So the first argument on that front, or divine temporality argument number 2, is the fact that based on divine relations with the temporal world, this entails God must be temporal as well. So the next argument, obviously God stands in various relations with creatures, right? He stands in a causal relation with the universe. He caused the universe. He sustains the universe in existence. He stands in a sustaining relation. And this, he's good, perfectly loving. So he loves creatures and that sort of thing. And if you believe in the incarnation, he entered into human history and he acquired a human thing. So there's both a certain intrinsic, or at the very least, extrinsic changes that God undergoes just by the act of having a temporal creation or universe in existence. And this proves that God himself must also be temporal, at least with a created universe. From the temporal moment of creation, God must stand in certain sustaining and or coexisting with relations alongside the temporal universe. So how would this argument work in deductive form? So it's a simple 3-premise argument again. Premise 1, God is creatively active in the temporal world. Premise 2, if God is creatively active in the temporal world, well, then God is really related to the temporal world. Premise 3 then is, well, if God is really related to the temporal world, well, then God is temporal, at least contingently temporal. Again, not necessarily essentially temporal, because without creation, again, he could exist timelessly. We've seen no arguments that prove he couldn't exist timelessly. So it could be either or. Maybe he's temporal without creation in some sense, or maybe he's timeless with it. We've got no reason to favor one or the other. But this argument is just saying, well, contingently, if he's created the universe and he's really related to this temporal creation, well, then God must be temporal. We know that much. So conclusion, therefore, God is temporal, contingently temporal. So what do we say in terms of evaluation? So premise 1 is obviously true. Whether you're a proponent of divine timelessness or divine temporality, you're going to agree with premise 1. God is creatively active in the temporal world. He created the universe and that sort of thing. He caused it to exist and he sustains it in existence. He stands in certain loving relationships with human beings and that sort of thing. Okay, so what can the proponent of divine timelessness object to in this argument? And he can object to either premise 2 or premise 3. So in terms of premise 2, this almost seems like a self-evident premise, and it has to be admitted that nobody today, no philosopher of time or logician today, would really take an issue with premise 2. They'd say, no, it's self-evidently true. You have to admit that this is correct. But in the medieval period, a bunch of theologians like Thomas Aquinas, however, would deny premise 2. And their main reason for that was based on false assumptions from pagan Greek mythology and stuff like that and philosophy. And remember, they had that radical notion of divine simplicity. God is absolutely simple, can't stand and doesn't stand in any relations to anything else. He's just totally simple. He has no relationships, not even within himself, and that sort of thing. All his attributes are one. His essence is the same as his existence. He's just pure existence, pure being. That was this radical medieval doctrine of divine simplicity that I argued for in part 5A was totally false and incoherent as a doctrine, so that we don't need to believe it. But nonetheless, Thomas Aquinas believed it, and on this basis, he would reject premise 2 and say that, well, God, yes, he is creatively active in the temporal world, but that doesn't mean that God's really related to the temporal world. There's no real relationship or relations between God and the temporal world. And he would give the example of, well, look, when you say that God caused the existence, or he's sustaining it, or he's in the relation of sovereignly ruling over creation, these aren't real relations. They're really illusory on the part of creatures. Because in reality, God stands in no relations. He's totally simple. He stands in no relations to anything. And this could be akin to someone being jealous of another person. So we have jealous John. John is jealous of Jim. And he'll say, well, there's no real two-way relationship going on here. Now, it's true that John, representing the temporal creature in our case, is really related to Jim. He stands in the envious of relation. He's envious of Jim. But it's not real to say that Jim is really related to John in any way. He's not affected, he's not changed, he doesn't even know or care that John is jealous of him. So he doesn't stand in a envied by relation. That's an illusory relationship. And they'll say, well, it's the same with God. It's illusory on God's part. He didn't really cause us. He doesn't really sustain us in being and stuff like that. That's illusory. It's just from our perspective, we stand in a relation kind of thing of being caused or being sustained in existence. But God is totally oblivious, he's totally unaffected, and he's totally unchanged by this. So that's how the argument works. It's based on this distinction where God is merely passively related to creation, just like Jim is only passively related to John. Creatures, or John, are actively related to God and or to Jim, because John is jealous of Jim, so he's actively related. But Jim is only passively related to John, and it's the same with God, as I said. So that's how the argument works. But this distinction between the passive and active relation is just total nonsense and makes no sense. I would say it's incoherent kind of thing. I don't think that there's a difference. You really are in a relation, whether you know it or not, or are affected by it, or are changed by it or not, there's still a relationship going on. You are in the envied by relation. But let's pretend this distinction goes through. This argument still fails, because God is not in a passive relation. He is in an active relation. We are supposing that God's relationship to the universe, he stands in multiple causal relations, and these are active causal relations because they are actively related. They are actively related to God's power and his intrinsic attributes as the first cause of the universe. So, real effects, like the contingent existence of a temporal universe, require real causes. You can't escape by saying it's illusory in any way. It can't be. Otherwise, the effect would be illusory. It wouldn't exist. And what's more, God has extrinsically changed in relation to creation, as we can imagine a possible world with God where all else is equal except that God never created the universe. Well, in that case, God's knowledge, God's love, God's will would be entirely different than it is in the actual world. And this means that God is being intrinsically changed. And what's the only factor that changes that? His will, love, and knowledge? It's the fact that creation is there. So creation is affecting him, actively affecting his knowledge, his love, and his will, because now God loves human beings, whereas he doesn't, because there's no human beings to love in the other world. He has knowledge of these human beings, whereas he doesn't in the other world. He's got a will for them. He wills to save them and not send them to hell and damnation. Well, that doesn't exist in a world where it's just God and there's no creation. So yeah, these are active relationships, and you can't avoid it. So Thomas Aquinas' argument totally fails, and pretty much every philosopher today would never say this. It really comes from that biased presupposition of pagan philosophy where you believe in divine simplicity, and that's total nonsense. So this argument should be rejected, and premise 2 should be upheld. So really, contemporary philosophers have to object to premise 3. That's the only way. If you want to say God is divinely timeless and not temporal, the only way you can escape this argument proving that he is temporal, with creation at least, is by denying premise 3. And that's exactly what a few philosophers have done. Okay, so the first pair of philosophers who've attempted to do this are Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann. We mentioned them earlier. And these are modern-day philosophers who've attempted to deny premise 3 based on something akin to the special theory of relativity. So if you remember, we covered that as an argument for divine timelessness, and they deny that there's no privileged God reference inertial frame. It's all relative to whatever velocity or speed of motion you're going at. And there is no simultaneity apart from being able to synchronize your clocks, depending on which inertial reference frame you are in. So they kind of pick up on this notion, and they try to say, well, look, maybe it's possible that to deny premise 3, which states that if God is really related to the temporal world, well, then God must be temporal. They say, no, maybe God could be really related to a temporal world, but still be timeless. using something akin to STR. And they call it the eternal temporal simultaneity doctrine. So basically, they come up with maybe there's a new type of simultaneity relation that is entailed by a timeless God existing together at once, not at one and the same time. Sorry, let me rephrase that. So there's a new kind of simultaneity relation. So the traditional one is to say, well, look, God and creation exist together at once at one and the same time. That's the ordinary traditional definition. That would say, well, God's in time, creation's in time, and they're relating to each other at exactly the same time at once. That's what it means to be simultaneous, or to have a simultaneity relation. But they say, well, no, maybe there's a different one, because there can be an eternal present if you look outside in the eternity reference frame. By eternity, they mean timeless. And they'll say, well, maybe there's this eternal temporal simultaneity, or ET simultaneity, as they call it. And they'll say, well, look, maybe from the timeless eternity observer perspective or reference frame, God could be timeless, but from the creation or temporal creatures reference frame, God is temporal and therefore can relate to them and that sort of thing. So Stump and Kretzmann really propose that both the timeless and temporal modes of existence are reference frames with two separate observers, one observer being timeless and the other temporal. And essentially what this means is it says, well, look, a timeless God and temporal humans are ET simultaneous, or eternally temporal simultaneous with each other, because both exist at the same eternal present moment relative to the eternal timeless reference frame, and both exist at the same temporal moment relative to the temporal reference frame. And in this way, God can be temporal and temporally related to his creation and timeless at the same time. He's temporal in one reference frame and timeless in the eternity or timeless reference frame. So that's sort of their thing. But obviously this has massive problems. It's logically contradictory. It sounds logically contradictory. It doesn't sound to be proper. And most philosophers of time have rejected this as being a false in a variety of ways. But the main issue is, look, it's just explanatorily vacuous. It does nothing to explain anything. There's no mention of, well, how do we measure the difference or determine eternally temporal simultaneity and determine if they're actually happening in the eternal present from the eternally timeless reference frame, for example. And there is no way to do that. Whereas with Einstein's special theory of relativity, no, you could synchronize your clocks, and if your clocks read the same measure, temporal measure, or using metric time within a single inertial frame, so you're both going the same uniform motion, and your clocks are synchronized precisely at the same measured time, that's what it means to be simultaneous in special theory of relativity. But this ET simultaneity has nothing like that to measure simultaneousness, and because of that, it's just vacuous. It's just an assertion that's unproven and doesn't really even make sense. We just come back to a restatement of the original problem of how do we know that a timeless cause could be related to a temporal effect? And nothing about this ET simultaneity answers that fundamental question, apart from just asserting that it must happen. And what's worse, though, even worse, even if this was ET simultaneity were true, then that proves that God must be temporal and can't be timeless, because he would be temporally simultaneous with every temporal event. So that, yeah. And I have a quote here, let me just see if I can find it, by a fellow proponent of divine timelessness, Paul Helm. So Paul Helm of the University of London, who, again, he's also a defender of divine timelessness. And he's in the book, I think, defending this view with William Lane Craig and Alan Paget and Nicholas Wolstershoff, giving 4 different views of God and time. That's a great book because you get counter responses in the 4 views there. But anyways, Paul Helm, he says, look, I'm not trying to be uncharitable, but Stump and Kretzmann's quote-unquote solution to the problem is found simply by rewording the problem itself with the help of some rhetorical device known as ET simultaneity. ET simultaneity has no independent merit or use. Nothing is illuminated nor explained by it. It is useless. And what's interesting here is that even Stump and Kretzmann themselves have admitted this after the fact. And they've come and said, yep, our original theory is about ET simultaneity is totally rubbish, in their own words, and that sort of thing. But they, to their credit, they reworked what they mean by ET simultaneity, or eternally temporal simultaneity. And they said, well, let's redefine it this way in terms of causal relations rather than observer reference frames. And they say, look, X and Y are ET simultaneous if X is eternally present and Y temporally present, and the observer can causally relate to both X and Y. But the main problem here, even with this modification, their argument still fails, because to show that a timeless God could be temporally related, because this new definition of ET simultaneous is basically viciously circular and therefore logically impossible to be true. It's begging the question. Because all it's doing is just saying, well, in terms of the original problem, that was to explain how it is even possible for a timeless God to cause anything in time. But ET simultaneity, under this new definition, it just defines itself as the ability of a timeless cause to cause something within time. So it just begs the question. It doesn't answer how it's possible. It just says, well, we've defined ET simultaneity as the ability to do it. So therefore, it's able to do it. Yeah, that doesn't work. I've got another quote here from another proponent of divine timelessness, Brian Leftow, and this is what he makes of the new updated thing. He says, look, quote unquote, any definition of ET simultaneity which invokes any form of ET causality is implicitly circular, and viciously so. For to fully explain how ET causation can occur, we must bring in the concept of ET simultaneity. If we do, we cannot then define ET simultaneity by invoking ET causation. For then the concept to be defined, in effect, recurs in the definition, making it viciously circular. So that's what Brian Leftow has to say about the Stump and Kretzmann's attempt at trying to define what ET simultaneity is and use that to try and link a timeless God with temporal relations in the world. They can't do it. And it utterly fails. And ultimately, their original attempt, even they admit, was a failure. And then they move on to this second definition, which is basically viciously circular. And they just say, well, ET simultaneity means that you can do ET causation. There, we've solved the problem. No, you can't just define it like that. It's like saying, God, the definition of God is he exists, so therefore he exists. No, you can't reason like that. Okay, so how does Brian Leftow, how does he argue that a timeless God can really relate to temporal creatures? And his argument is basically to say, well, temporal creatures aren't just temporal. They're both temporal and timeless, and God relates to them timelessly and that sort of thing. So you say, what? How the heck does that work? And he basically says, well, my argument has three fundamental assumptions. Number one, the distance between God and everything in space is zero. Number two, spatial things do not change in any way unless there is a change of place, i.e. a motion involving a material thing through space. And then assumption three, if something is in time, it is necessarily also in space. And obviously through this, he says, well, look, God, the distance between God and everything is zero, so there's no motion, there's no movement. God's not in space, and also since they're not moving through space in their relations with God, that must mean that human beings are timeless as well when they relate to God. This is essentially how his argument works, but unfortunately all three of these assumptions are totally false. With the first premise, for example, this is just a category error on his part, because it's not zero distance is not the same thing as being spaceless. It's not like, oh, there's a distance and it's the value zero. no, that's not the same as being spaceless, having no distance at all. Distance just doesn't apply to God. God transcends all of space in that sense, right? So this is based on a category error, and is therefore a failure as an argument on that basis alone. What about presumption number two? Well, on an A theory of time, as we proved in our cosmological argument proper in the part two show, um, look, it's something could remain spatial in terms of having spatial location and spatial extension, but yet, even if it remains the same spatially, it can still change in its temporal properties if we assume an A theory of time, for example. So this isn't true. And then finally, assumption three is just false. I mean, something is not also in time. Something that's in time doesn't necessarily have to be spatial as well. This is just based on misunderstandings of the general theory, special and general theories of relativity. It assumes the B theory of time or space-time realism. Remember, in part two, we addressed the space-time Minkowski interpretation versus the neo-Lorentzian interpretation of relativity, and that the Lorentzian view is better, superior, and or at least empirically equivalent. But it's an utter failure. I mean, especially as a Christian theist, Brian Leftow should know better. I mean, angels and demons are temporal beings that aren't spatial. So this assumption is totally proven to be false biblically as well. And just logically, it's angels and demons are conceivable as non-spatial spiritual substances or beings. And one final note here about Leftow's argument is he says, well, look, all of temporal becoming is illusory. He specifically denies this, but in effect, his argument makes it totally illusory. And it suffers from incoherence because no event can exist earlier than, simultaneous with, or later than. These are all temporal relations. But they can't exist. No event can exist with these relations with respect to God's reference frame, because that would entail temporal relations, thus God would be flung into temporality. And the proponent of divine timelessness doesn't like that. They're trying to deny premise three. But Brian Leftow's attempt here just leaves God as a total non-omniscient, irrational mess in terms of all temporal events are just unrelated to him. It's like a scrambled up jigsaw puzzle, World War II and World War I going on in his head at the same time. He's just totally mixed up. He doesn't understand the temporal relations between them, and that just seems ridiculous to envision an omniscient God just not understanding any temporal relations and just having a bunch of video clips from all temporal moments combined floating in his head simultaneously, and he doesn't understand the relations between them. No, that's ridiculous. So yeah, I don't think that these arguments work against premise three. Therefore, premise three has been proven and established to be true on a balance of probabilities, I think. So I think this argument is our first success, and it works at proving that at least with a temporal creation, God must be temporal based on his divine relations to temporal beings and to the temporal creation. What's our next, third and final argument for divine temporality? Again, this is one that assumes with creation, a temporal creation. It's based on divine omniscience and the existence of tensed facts, how God relates to tensed and knows tensed facts. So let's get into that argument now. Okay, so how does this argument go? Basically, it says, look, given it's a fact that we live in a temporal creation or universe, well, that just means that tensed facts necessarily and undeniably come as part and parcel. There's past, present, and future, or earlier than and later than relations, and there are certain tensed facts. We give certain statements or sentences. Dale will finish his show tomorrow, August 16th, 2021. Well, that will and tomorrow are temporal indexicals language, right? And that it's a way of locating the truth of the statement. So this statement has a truth value, and that is basically corresponding to a future fact. Tomorrow will be August 16th from when I'm recording this part of the show. and it's either true or it's false as to whether I'll be finished the show or not as of August 16th. So there, it has a truth value, and it's based on the tense in relation to the present. So it's locating the truth value one day into the future in relation to the present, which is now, August 15th at 7 o'clock p.m. or whatever it is. So obviously, I think tensed expressions provide tensed facts and relate to tensed facts. We could give thousands of examples of past tense, future tense sentences to try and illustrate that we do have these. We kind of went over this in part 2 when we gave an argument based on the fact that there was tensed language. It's sort of a linguistic argument, and this one sort of reflects that, in the philosophy of language and that sort of thing. So, okay, so great. If there are tensed truths, tensed facts that can be either true or false relative to when they're said to have taken place or whatever, relative to their temporal indexicals, therefore there are temporal facts, and an omniscient God would have to know that. So the deductive argument would go like this. A temporal world exists as premise 1. Premise 2, God is omniscient, meaning he knows all true propositions. Premise 3, if a temporal world exists, and if God is omniscient, well then God knows tensed facts. And then finally, premise 4, if God is timeless, then he doesn't know tensed facts. And conclusion, therefore God is not timeless, and through logical equivalence, that means he must be temporal. Now, by way of assessment, premises 1, we live in a temporal world exists, that's obviously true. And in fact, I proved in part 2 of our cosmological argument that the A theory of time is correct, with an 82% degree of certainty. Premise 2, God is omniscient. Every theist, whether you're a divine timeless proponent or a divine temporality proponent, you'll agree with premise 2. So these two premises, bada boom, green check marks, 100% proven for both of them. Now, premise 3 and premise 4 are where things get a little bit more controversial. So let's start with premise 4 first. Is it possible to deny that, well, if God is timeless, then he doesn't know tensed facts? Some philosophers have tried to say, no, God is timeless, and he can know tensed facts. So how do they go about doing this? Well, in the first place, it's been argued on the basis of 3 prominent philosophers. So the first is a guy named Jonathan Kavanvig, and he kind of argues that, well, look, God doesn't necessarily directly grasp these tensed facts. He only indirectly grasps the essence, or the common essence, or what he calls factual content that is shared with these tenseless statements that we give. And there's this timeless truth essence to these tensed sentences that we as creatures give. And that's what God grasps. So he grasps the tenseless essential truths of tensed sentences directly, and through that means he indirectly grasps the truth of the tensed sentences and that sort of thing. That's how this argument works. So for example, yesterday was June 1st. And today is June 1st. According to Jonathan Kavanvig, these are saying the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Essentially, the factual content is the same, right? Namely that June 1st date. And that's what a timeless God, he can know that. He can know June 1st or something and assign tenseless time coordinates to it or something, perhaps. Unfortunately, this explanation is highly implausible. So it's obvious that the temporal indexicals, yesterday and today, are part of the essential gist of these tensed sentences. You cannot divorce that and say, well, these are not essential, as though you're studying the Gospels and you've got secondary and essential details, and you say, well, we've got the gist, but the temporal indexicals are just secondary details. We don't have to worry about that. No, that's part of the essential gist of these tensed sentences. Yesterday was June 1st is essential. Yesterday is essential. Today is June 1st. Today is essential for understanding what these tensed sentences are saying and in terms of their truth value. So God, a timeless God, cannot know the truth value of these sentences in relation to the essential temporal indexicals, and therefore he wouldn't be omniscient. This argument fails for trying to defeat premise 4, in my opinion. And really, what Kvenvig is doing here is he's just giving a subtle way of denying that there are any such things as tensed facts at all. So everything just exists tenselessly, and as we saw before, that's wholly implausible, right? The A theory of time, B theory of time is false, and the A theory of time has been proven to be true, given our four arguments for that in our part 2 show of our cosmological argument. Okay, a second attempt has been made by another philosopher to deny premise 4. His name is Edward Werewanka. I'm horrible with names, sorry. But he argues that, okay, well, I like what John Kvenvig said above. Moments of time have individual essences. But he goes further than Kvenvig. He doesn't deny what he does. He says, no, the factual content, the essential gist, does include tense. You're absolutely right, Dale. You're absolutely right, Dr. William Lane Craig, and that sort of thing. The tense is part of the essential gist, at least with present tense sentences, minimally. And obviously, Werewanka is assuming an A theory of time, just like us. So for him, just the present exists. The future doesn't exist, the past no longer exists. And he kind of uses this and he says, well, the past doesn't exist in any real ontological sense, neither does the future. But yet, here and now in the present, it makes sense to make tensed sentences, past tense sentences, future tense sentences. So obviously, here in the present, all moments of time must have as part of their individual essences, there must be some amount of presentness that's involved, even with future tense and past tense sentences. But once again, this is just kind of an incoherent notion. It really just kind of envisions a timeless God somehow grasping the essence of all temporal moments, while at the same time, no such moment is truly present for him personally. So if you imagine the statement, John left 3 hours ago, well, there's no problem for a timeless God to know that John has the property of being such that John leaves 3 hours earlier than some designated tenseless clock time, T. The coordinates 3 p.m., June 1st, 2020. A timeless God can know that, but that's not what the tensed sentences are going. Once we include the notion that T has essential presentness, or is the now, so to speak, right? And that's what's serving as the time factor. John left now, or something like that. Or if we say John left 4 hours ago, so the now is changed from 3 hours to allowing that he left 4 hours ago, and that sort of thing. So there is this essential presentness that has to be known by God, and a timeless God could not know that. He could never know that T is now or present, for example. And that's what you would have to know, because Werewanka, again, apparently says, well, God could know this presentness aspect. That is part of the individual essences of these sayings, of many of these temporal statements and that sort of thing. But a timeless God just can't know that. He can never know that T is now, whatever time, 3 hours or 4 hours or whatever. And that's necessary in order for a timeless God to properly understand the essence or factual content of these tensed facts. So yeah, I don't think that this works. Arguing that presentness is part of the essence of every moment of time. This only reaffirms the need for God to be temporal in nature. So yeah, this defeater for premise 4 fails. Okay, the third and final defeater for denying premise 4 is given by our old friend Brian Leftow. And he's argued that premise 4, again, is false based on his notion of the ET simultaneity relation and timeless reference frames, getting into relativity theory, base theories, and stuff like that. But he says, well, look, God's timeless reference frame in eternity, it doesn't have any past, present, or future tensed facts to know of in the first place. Instead, what the timeless God knows are all facts of quote-unquote simultaneity relative to a temporal reference frame that God doesn't inhabit. So that's how a timeless God can know tensed facts. This is Brian Leftow's attempt here. But really, this is really a tenseless form of knowledge. It's not tensed. He doesn't really know any tensed facts just by knowing about simultaneity relationships. So God, it doesn't make sense to say that God's omniscient in any way here. And Brian Leftow admits this. He says, well, look, God, he just bites the bullet. God is just factually omniscient. And we'll get into that. That's kind of going to be relevant to when he tries to defeat premise 3. We'll get into that in a little bit. In terms of premise 4, this just fails in my opinion. Look, there are clearly temporal facts about the past, present, and future of temporal events in our world. And God, under Brian Leftow's view, he would be totally ignorant of these facts if he was timeless. And no relative simultaneity is sufficient for having knowledge of these kinds of facts. So yeah, in that case, this argument would be a failure. It's just a tantamount to denying that God is omniscient. We can't do that, premise 2. And Brian Leftow wouldn't want to necessarily do that. So yeah, I think with these 4 attempts to defeat the truth of premise 4 being defeated, that's the best that's out there. And I think it's fairly obvious and self-evidently true that premise 4 is true. If God is timeless, then he can't know tensed facts. If there are any tensed facts, a timeless God would have to be ignorant and totally oblivious of these things. Okay, great. But what about premise 3 then? And that says if a temporal world exists and if God is omniscient, then God knows tensed facts. We kind of hinted at this. How could someone deny this? And there are actually a couple ways to try and defeat this. I'm not going to get into the second way because that's a technical argument. Read Dr. William Lane Craig's work on this, and that's sort of based on a linguistic type argument that I don't feel like getting into. I'm kind of in a rush. I want to make sure I get all my solo show promises fulfilled before I start up the fall semester. But I do want to go over the main one, the one that I think is most important. We've already hinted at that. It comes from Brian Leftow, and it's the fact that he just redefines God's omniscience and what that means. And he says, well, God is quote-unquote factually omniscient. So what does that mean? So obviously when we are defining omniscience, it traditionally means that God knows all true propositions. He has all propositional knowledge, in contrast with other forms of knowledge. But some people like Brian Leftow have mentioned, well, maybe there are tensed facts. Or sorry, it's not. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't. That God has to know those from his perspective as a timeless being. The moments of time are perspectives relative to which intended facts, tensed facts exist. So, well, we as temporal creatures, we have to know tensed facts. God doesn't. It's not part of the definition of omniscience for God to know tensed facts. He's a timeless God. That's not part of his perspective. Subjective perspective is timeless for him. It's not tense, so he doesn't need to know any of that. And he's still omniscient. He's factually omniscient. Unfortunately, this can't be possible. It denies God's aseity because it basically says, well, look, there are certain tensed facts out there that creatures know that ultimately aren't grounded in God's knowledge in some place, and that violates God's aseity. God is the grounding of all true propositions and facts. He is truth, and that includes tensed ones. And further, appealing to God's ignorance when it comes to certain forms of knowledge. Brian Leftow, for example, will appeal to say, well, God doesn't know what it's like to be a sinner. I've said this myself. God doesn't know what it's like to be, or how it feels to be guilty, or how it feels to be Dale Glover. And that's true, right? God is ignorant on this front. He's not omniscient in the sense that he has every form of knowledge and that sort of thing. So there are truths out there that God doesn't know in a sense. But what we have to understand is when we say that God is omniscient, we just mean that he has all warranted true beliefs. He has all propositional truths. He has all, as philosophers call it, knowledge that something is true. But that does not apply to other forms of knowledge. There are three types of knowledge, remember? There's knowledge by acquaintance or experiential knowledge. God doesn't have any knowledge by acquaintance of sin. He's not acquainted with being a sinner in the same way human beings are. And that would be an imperfection to imagine that God had knowledge of sin. Nope. And also, this argument in particular relies on know-how, or knowledge how it feels to sin, or knowledge how it feels to be Dale Glover, or something like that. Yeah, God can lack know-how in that sense. He doesn't know how it feels to lie, or to murder, or to rape someone. But he has all propositional knowledge. He knows the proposition. It is true that you should feel guilty if you rape someone or if you sin. It is true you should feel depressed if you are. He knows all those propositional truths. So that's all omniscience means. And unfortunately, this definition here, factual omniscience, is nothing of the sort. There are facts that this omniscient God doesn't know of the tensed variety, and just appealing, well, God's in a subjective perspective of timelessness. Who cares? There's still true propositions or facts that are not ultimately grounded in God, and thus, in my opinion, this argument's an utter failure to deny premise 3. So yeah, bada boom, bada bing. That's it. There's no way to defeat premise 3 that's plausible, and it's again self-evidently true. So yeah, that's it for the arguments. In terms of my main conclusions, we had 2 arguments that worked. All the rest of them were 50% or less. And under Bayes' theorem, you don't include anything that's 50% or less in the calculation, unless you're saying, if you say we got 40% for 10% for one of the arguments, you wouldn't plug in 10% into the equation to get the cumulative case total, unless you're saying, well, that 10% translates into a positive claim on the opposite end for the negation, namely that it's false that God is temporal or God is timeless. Like, we got 10% for one of the arguments that God is timeless. Well, if 10% could be translated, that's not the same as saying, well, that means there's a 90% probability that God is temporal. No, that the failure of the argument doesn't prove that the opposite is true in this case. If it did, then you would include those numbers. But because it doesn't in this sense, that's why you ignore anything 50% or less, you ignore from the calculation. It's only the successful arguments, and we've got 2. The last 2 based on God's provably being temporal contingent on the existence of a temporal creation. And my total probability here is 96.28% probable. So that's proven beyond reasonable doubt. That's incredible. But there's a little hitch here, because both of these arguments, again, contingent on a temporal creation existing. And also, these are also contingent, even though I didn't mention that in the arguments, on the A theory of time being true. So if you propose a B theory or a hybrid A-B theory, you can escape these 2 arguments for divine temporality that we've just given, that were successful. And again, they don't speak to the essence of God and that sort of thing. So, in that case, well, we proved that the A theory of time was true 82% in our Cosmological Argument Proper Series Part 2. So 82 times 96.28% equals a 78.95% proven that God is temporal with a temporal creation. It's a contingent temporality that we've proven with a near 80% degree of certainty or degree of warrant. Okay, great. But what about God's eternity? Did we forget about creation? Without creation, is God been eternally existing all by himself? Is he temporal or timeless? And we haven't answered that. We can't answer that. However, I do think that we can say that, given we know that from our Cosmological Argument Proper series that the universe is in fact finite, it's not infinite in the past. And there's also that argument that we hinted at before as part of like an excursus about, well, why, if God was around for an actually infinite amount of time, a metric time conception, our temporal dimension with temporal intervals, differentiated intervals, or instants, whatever you want to say. I would go with the intervals. Okay. Well, then why didn't God? There's no reason why God wouldn't have created an infinite amount of time ago rather than 13 billion years ago. No, he wouldn't have acquired a reason just 13 billion years ago. He would have had that reason from eternity, and the universe would be eternal. We know that that's factually wrong. Therefore, God can't be temporal without creation in the sense of metric or differentiated time. There can't be various temporal intervals, 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, 5 second for God living all the way up until he finally decides to create. And William Lane Craig gives an argument in deductive form as this. So on his book Time and Eternity, page 230, he says, premise 1, if the past is infinite, then at time t, God delayed creating the universe until time t plus n. Premise 2, if at t, God delayed creating until time t plus n, then he must have had a good reason for doing so. Premise 3, if the past is infinite, God cannot have had a good reason for delaying at time t, creating until time t plus n. Premise 4 is a sub-conclusion. Therefore, if the past is infinite, God must have had a good reason for delaying at time t, and God cannot have had a good reason for delaying at time t as well, based on the prior three premises. So that's a contradiction. Therefore, the past cannot be infinite as the main conclusion. And I think that this argument works, in addition to the other arguments that we saw in our cosmological argument, proving that an actual infinite, quantitative infinite, of which past infinity of temporal interval, instants and or intervals would count as such in metric or differentiated time, so that option is ruled out. And this argument isn't just talking about the mode of God's eternality in terms of a contingent fact, contingent on there being a temporal creation. This argument is actually based on the essential nature of God's eternality. So it's essentially true, necessarily true, that God by essence, as an eternal being, could not, on the success of this argument in whatever degree you assign, and I assign it very, very, very probable to almost absolute certainty in my own subjective probability value judgments. But anyways, it's saying essentially God cannot be temporal in a metric or differentiated sense of time. And that includes whether it's a hyper-time dimension, hyper-time dimension like Hugh Ross, or whatever you want to postulate there. It doesn't matter. This argument proves that God cannot be that. There can't be an actual infinite amount of temporal intervals, quantifiable, countable temporal intervals throughout past eternity that God was living in. So that option is ruled out by this argument. And okay, well, what's left then? What would essentially speaking, what are the options available for God's mode of eternality then? So there's only two options that God without creation could be. He could be eternally temporal or everlasting in the sense of being in an undifferentiated, non-metric or amorphous time dimension, pure duration. And that was God just existed in that time eternally. There's no actual infinite that's postulated to go along with that. And so this option absolutely is on the table. If you're a Christian theist and you want to know, well, how did God exist? What was the mode of God's eternality without creation? Well, you could say maybe he existed existed eternally in amorphous or undifferentiated temporal dimension, temporally in this amorphous or undifferentiated way. In time, but there are no differentiations. It's pure duration. And this is what I argued in my solo show about Plato and Parmenides. I think that Plato makes a distinction between metric time and amorphous time or non-differentiated time, and that's real absolute time. So this is definitely an option. There are problems. This option is favored by a lot of Christian philosophers from Oxford University, called the Oxford School, for example. Richard Swinburne, people like that, as well. But there are some problems with this view that I'm not going to get into in this show. Things that, and I didn't have time to research into. But a great book, Nicholas Wolstershoff, for example, takes this amorphous type view. He argues that for a doctrine of unqualified divine temporality in the book God and Time, 4 views. Now that's great because it's got Dr. William Lane Craig's hybrid view, Nicholas Wolstershoff arguing for this amorphous view, which in the Oxford School has become known as metric conventionalism. It's the metric conventionalism view of time. If you want to research that in more detail and look into that a little bit more. So basically that is the view that there are no objective facts about the matter, whether there can be 2 separate intervals of time that can be said to be equal or unequal in extent. So that's what the view metric conventionalism has to do, and that's kind of associated with the Oxford School and this amorphous or undifferentiated view of time. Now, getting back to the 4 views on time book, it's also got Alan Paget, who argues for a relative time dimension or timelessness relatively. And then finally, Paul Helm, who argues for the absolute divine timeless view. So that's a great book. Unfortunately, because I'm in a rush, I didn't have time to read that book and incorporate the material as I would have liked to have done to give a fuller account of this argument regarding God's relationship to time. But obviously, again, I'm in a rush. I'm trying to, before the fall semester starts, I want to get all my promises out. Next up is that Jesus Mythicism show that I promised one of our listeners, White Girl on Instagram is the name she goes by, or the handle she goes by. But yeah, maybe in time it'll take a long time. I'm in no rush, but maybe over the course of some time, I will get into that book and provide little short shows or snippets from that 4 views book. Otherwise, I highly recommend you read it because it's great reading. I wish that I had time to incorporate that into this solo show, as I would have done if I wasn't in a kind of rushing things a bit to get everything done before September comes around. Okay, great. So in terms of the issue, so that's the amorphous view, but then there's the view that Dr. William Lane Craig and that I myself view. I was heavily influenced by Dr. William Craig. I think it's brilliant, and I think it's correct. It's the best view, is that, well, God is timeless without creation. He's totally non-temporal without creation. And time itself comes into being. Space and time and all of the universal contents, i.e. the universe, came into being at one temporal moment. So that's what I believe. God is timeless without creation and temporal with creation. And that's the best interpretation. That's the view that Dr. William Lane Craig has argued for in his scholarly works that I'll provide a link so you can go and check that out for more details. But yeah, that covers it. So that's basically, you have those 2 options to choose from, and I think the best option is to say God is timeless without creation and temporal with creation. Temporal in the sense that he's in our temporal dimension. He stands in temporal relations and has tensed knowledge just like every human being, irretrievably. He can't go back to being timeless. Once temporal, he's always temporal. But in terms of, that's just a contingent fact. God essentially doesn't have to be one or the other. He is just as perfect being timeless in his mode of eternality as he is being temporal and everlasting in his mode of eternality. Either way is just as good as each other. It has an equal overall value, and therefore it doesn't detract from God overall, in terms of overall utility value or something like that, for God to be either timeless or temporal. Either way, it's good on my account. So yeah, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the show, and as I said, the next solo show I'm going to be working on, hopefully to get up before September in the next couple weeks. Again, I'm quite busy with school. I have to write some mini essays, but I do want to get up at least one show on the Jesus mythicism And that will fulfill my last solo show promise from months ago to White Girl on Instagram. Okay, have a great day, everybody.